You've found the Stealth Podcast. Where are you watching from? What time is it there? Subscribe and comment to support us. Thanks. Let's begin. My name is Derek Folsom. I'm 34 years old, and I live out of a 2003 Winnebago Mini that I bought off a retired couple in Flagstaff for $4,000 cash. Home base, technically, is Albuquerque, or at least that's where I pick up mail at a UPS store on Central. I've been doing this for about 2 years now, and most nights I sleep fine. Most nights. Megan was the one who suggested we park on the east side of Menal Boulevard that Thursday. She's 29, does freelance graphic design on a laptop that's held together with 2 strips of electrical tape, and she's been traveling with me since Santa Fe. We weren't together. It was one of those things where you meet someone at a laundromat, start talking, realize they also live in a vehicle, and 3 days later, they're splitting diesel costs with you. Her van, a white Ford Transit she called the Loaf, had thrown a belt outside of Bernalillo, and she needed somewhere to stay while the part got shipped. That somewhere ended up being my Winnebago. We pulled into that lot around 9 at night. It sat between a shuttered mattress store and a cell tower maintenance yard. The kind of space that exists in every mid-sized American city, where nobody owns the air and nobody mows the weeds. There was already one other vehicle parked there, way at the back corner, an old Dodge Ram with a camper shell, dark, no plates visible from where I stopped. I noticed it, filed it away. Didn't think much of it because in this lifestyle you learn fast that a dark, quiet vehicle usually just means someone else doing exactly what you're doing, lying low and minding their own business. Megan heated up a can of green chili stew on the 2-burner propane stove while I ran the generator just long enough to charge both laptops. She had a deadline, some logo rebrand for a dentist in Tucson, and I had nothing in particular to do except read and stay out of her way. That was the rhythm we'd built in 3 days, and it worked. She had her corner, I had mine, and the Winnebago was just barely big enough that we could pretend we each had privacy. I remember the stew smelling good. Like, genuinely good, the kind of thing that makes a cramped space feel almost cozy. She'd added a green chili from a jar she'd been carrying since hatch, and the whole rig smelled like it. We ate on paper plates balanced on our knees, watching a thunderstorm roll across the Sandia Mountains to the east, those jagged peaks going white every few seconds with lightning too far away to hear. Albuquerque does that, gives you a light show from a safe distance like the sky is putting on something just for you. By 10:30, she was deep in her design work, headphones on, face lit blue by the screen. I cracked the small roof vent above my bunk and lay down with a paperback I'd grabbed from a free library box in Taos. Some beat-up Dean Koontz from the 90s. I made it about 40 pages before my eyes started going heavy. The generator had been off for an hour. The lot was quiet. Outside, the city made its usual ambient sound. Distant traffic, a siren somewhere west, the low electrical hum of the cell tower next door. Normal stuff. I put the book face down on my chest and let myself drift. I woke up at some point. I didn't check the clock because Megan had taken her headphones off and was sitting very still. Not typing, not moving, just sitting at the small dinette table with the laptop screen dimmed down low, her hands flat on the table, staring toward the front windshield. I watched her for a second, groggy, thinking maybe she just zoned out mid-thought the way people do at 2 in the morning when a deadline is eating them alive. But the way she was sitting wasn't the posture of someone zoning out. Her shoulders were up near her ears. I said her name quiet. She turned and looked at me and said, very calmly, the truck moved. I sat up. I looked out the windshield. The Dodge Ram with the camper shell was still in the back corner of the lot. Same place, same dark shape. I told her it looked the same to me. She shook her head slowly and said no. It had been parked facing the back fence before. Now it was facing us. I didn't have a good answer for that. I told myself we probably just hadn't paid close enough attention when we pulled in. Angles at night do funny things, especially in a parking lot where the only light is sodium orange and comes from a street lamp half a block away. I believe that explanation about 60%. The other 40% kept me sitting upright on my bunk for the next 20 minutes, watching that truck do absolutely nothing. Around 2 in the morning, I finally convinced myself, and Megan, mostly, that the truck was just sitting there, because someone was sleeping in it, same as us. We'd both been staring at it long enough that we were probably just manufacturing details that weren't there. That's what tired brains do. You know how you stare at a word long enough and it stops looking like a real word? Same thing. We were doing that with a Dodge Ram. Megan went back to her laptop but didn't put the headphones back on. I noticed that. She kept the volume on the laptop itself turned down low and left one ear available, which was her version of staying alert without admitting she was staying alert. I lay back down but didn't close my eyes all the way. Just watched the ceiling and listened to the lot. A car passed on Minall every few minutes. The cell tower hummed. The stew smell had faded to something faint and faintly sweet. Normal. All of it normal. Then the camper shell's interior light came on. Not the truck's cab, the shell in the back. A dull amber glow appeared at the small rectangular window cut into the rear of the shell. Just for a second, like someone had clicked on a flashlight and then thought better of it. Megan saw it too because she closed her laptop halfway and didn't move. We both just sat there in the dark of the Winnebago watching that amber square. It went off. The lot went back to black and orange sodium light. Neither of us said anything for a full minute. I finally said what I was thinking, which was that it was probably just somebody waking up to use a bottle or check their phone, the kind of boring, practical, completely unglamorous reality of living in a vehicle. Megan said, yeah, but she said the way people say, when they mean something closer to, I hear you, but I'm not done thinking about this. She cracked her knuckles one at a time, slowly, which I'd learned in 3 days was what she did when she was working through something she didn't want to say out loud. I got up and went to the small side window, not the windshield, the one on the passenger side that gave a slightly different angle on the back corner of the lot. I stood there in the dark, not touching the curtain, just looking through the gap where it didn't quite meet the frame. The Dodge Ram sat still. The shell window was dark. I could see the rear of the truck clearly enough, and I stood there long enough that my eyes adjusted fully, pulling detail out of the sodium orange dark. The truck's tailgate had something on it. Letters. I couldn't read them from that distance. I told myself it was a sticker, a bumper sticker, or a dealership plate frame. People put things on their trucks. That means nothing. What I couldn't explain away was what happened next. At some point while I was standing at that side window, I realized I couldn't see the camper shell's window anymore. Not because the angle was wrong, the angle was fine, but because something was now blocking it from the inside. Something dark and roughly rectangular pressed flat against the glass. Like a piece of cardboard, or a hand. I stepped back from the window and didn't say anything to Megan right away. I stood in the middle of the Winnebago in the dark and ran through the rational explanations. Cardboard, obviously. Someone who wanted privacy, same as us. We had curtains, they had whatever they had. A sleeping bag pushed up against the glass. Condensation doing something weird. But the shape was wrong for condensation and wrong for a sleeping bag. It was too flat, too deliberate, with straight edges on two sides. And it hadn't been there a minute ago. Megan asked what I was doing, standing in the middle of the rig like a statue. I told her what I'd seen. I laid it out plainly, the window, the shape, the timing. She listened without interrupting, which wasn't like her. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment and then said she wanted to move. Not park somewhere else, not wait and see. Move. Right now, she said. Start the engine and go. I almost agreed. I was 90% there, but the Dodge Ram was blocking the natural exit path. Not directly, but enough that pulling out would have meant going close, maybe 20 feet from it. And there was something in me that really did not want to do that. So I made a mistake. I said, let's wait 10 minutes and see if anything else happens. It's a thing I've thought about since. The specific stupidity of that sentence. Let's wait and see. Like we were watching a nature documentary and not two people alone in a dark lot with something that was actively, deliberately changing what it showed us. Megan didn't argue. She closed her laptop the rest of the way and sat in the dark. I sat across from her. We didn't talk. The lot outside was completely still. 8 minutes passed. I watched the clock on the microwave, and nothing happened. I was just starting to exhale, just started to think that maybe we'd built this whole thing out of bad light and paranoia, when something knocked on the side of the Winnebago. Not a tap, a knock. Deliberate, heavy, 3 beats. Like someone announcing themselves at a door they had every right to open. I want to be clear about what that knock did to the air inside the rig. It wasn't loud, exactly, but it landed like something physical, like the sound had weight. Megan's hand shot out and grabbed my wrist before I'd even fully registered what I'd heard. We sat frozen for a moment, and I could feel her pulse in her grip, or maybe that was my own. I genuinely couldn't tell. The knock had come from the driver's side, midsection, right where the main living area wall runs. Not the door, the wall. Someone standing outside in the dark, choosing not to knock on the door where there's a handle and a window and an obvious social contract, and instead knocking on a flat panel of fiberglass like they were checking if anyone was home in a way that had nothing to do with wanting to come in. That distinction mattered to me immediately, even if I couldn't have explained why. I didn't move toward the window. Megan's grip on my wrist tightened when I shifted my weight, and honestly, I wasn't going to look anyway. I'd watched enough stupid decisions play out in my head to know that pressing your face to a curtain to see who's outside after 3 deliberate knocks on your wall at 2 in the morning is one of the all-time great terrible ideas. So we sat. I counted seconds in my head. Got to 30. Nothing. Got to 60. The lot outside was silent in a way that felt pressurized, like the silence was doing something, working at something. After maybe 2 minutes, I moved, slowly, low, on my hands and knees across the floor to the driver's seat. Not to look out. To reach the keys I'd left in the cup holder. Old habit. When I feel the situation shifting, I want the option to move. I got the keys into my hand without making noise, sat in the driver's seat in the dark, and looked out the windshield at the lot in front of me. The Dodge Ram was still there. Still dark. No movement. What I saw instead was to my left, just at the edge of the windshield frame, a figure standing at the corner of the shuttered mattress store. Just standing there, not moving. Dark clothes, couldn't make out a face from that angle and distance, but the posture was just still. The kind of still that isn't waiting for a bus. The figure is close to the building, close enough to have been in the shadow a minute ago, and stepped just barely out of it. And I had the very clear feeling that it had been there for a while. Doing nothing, just watching the Winnebago. I didn't say anything to Megan yet. I sat with that information for a moment. Figure by the building. Truck in the corner. Knock on the wall. 3 data points. I started the engine. Megan moved immediately when she heard it turn over. She was in the passenger seat in about 4 seconds flat. No words, just buckled herself in and put both hands on the edge of the dashboard like she was bracing. I didn't pull straight out. I turned on just the parking lights, not the headlights, and I rolled forward slowly at first, angling away from the truck, giving myself the widest possible arc around it. The lot was unpaved at the edges, hard-packed dirt with broken glass. I could hear crackling under the tires, and I kept it slow, so I wasn't making more noise than I had to. As we came around, and the headlights swept the corner where the figure had been standing, there was nobody there. Just the sidewall of the mattress store and a shopping cart on its side, and some dry weeds. I didn't slow down. I turned on a Minol heading west, and put the rig up to speed and didn't look in the rearview mirror for a full block because I didn't trust what I might see. We drove for a while without talking. I headed south and then west on I-40 just to be moving, just to put road between us and that lot. Megan sat with her knees pulled up and her arms around them, staring out the passenger window at the highway lights going by. After about 10 minutes, she said, "Who knocks on a wall?" Not as a question exactly, more like something she was working out. I told her I didn't know. She said, "Not on the door. On the wall." I said, "Yeah." She went quiet again. We ended up pulling off a truck stop near Rio Rancho. A big lit-up Flying J with 18-wheelers idling in rows and a Subway inside that was still open. We parked under a light between 2 semis and sat there with the engine off for a minute. The normalcy of it, the diesel smell, the fluorescence, the faint sound of a country radio station someone had going in a nearby cab, hit me like something I hadn't realized I needed. Megan uncurled herself from the passenger seat and said she was going to get a coffee. I said I'd come with her. Neither of us wanted to be alone, and we both knew it, and neither of us said that part. We stayed at the Flying J until almost 4 in the morning. Megan got a large coffee, and I got a bottle of water and a bag of pretzels I didn't really want, and we sat at one of the little plastic tables inside and just existed in the fluorescent light for a while. A trucker at the next table was watching something on his phone with the volume all the way up, some action movie, explosions, the works, and I have never been more grateful for someone else's bad volume control in my life. Normal noise. Human noise. Around 3:30, Megan pulled up the lot on Google Maps. Satellite view, then street view, walking it around the edges. The mattress store was called Sleep King, and it had been closed for at least a year based on the faded sign visible in the street view image. The lot behind it was listed as commercial vacant. She zoomed in on the cell tower maintenance yard next door and found a company name on a sign in one of the photos, a contractor out of Texas, not local. Nothing on the Dodge Ram because there was nothing to find. It was just a truck, but she found something else. She was scrolling through older satellite images. There's a feature in maps that lets you step back through image dates, and she stopped on one from about 14 months back. She tilted the laptop toward me without saying anything. In the older image, the lot had more debris in it, old tires and broken pallets. But at the far edge of the frame, near the maintenance yard fence, there was a structure. Not a building exactly, more like a lean-to, tarps and wood, the kind of thing that goes up when someone's living rough and needs shelter that won't blow over in a storm. It was gone in the current satellite image. Cleared out, probably, by whoever maintained the fence line. I looked at that image for a while. Then I looked at Megan, and she was already looking at me with that expression she'd had since we left the lot. Not panicked, not even particularly shaken anymore, just very, very focused. She said, so somebody knew that spot. Not knew it was a good parking spot. Knew the lot. Knew the patterns of it, who came and went, how long people stayed. I thought about the truck with no visible plates, the way it had turned to face us at some point while we weren't watching, the deliberate geometry of the knock. Not the door, the wall. And the figure that had simply stepped back into nothing when the headlights came around. We didn't go back. That's the obvious part. We found a Walmart on the west side and parked in their overnight lot with about a dozen other RVs and travelers. All of us in our little self-contained worlds, and I slept for 4 hours with a deadbolt thrown and a folding chair wedged under the interior door handle. Old habit that I'd gotten out of. I got back into it that night. What I couldn't shake, and still can't honestly, was the timeline. The knock came after the light in the camper shell, which came after the truck had apparently repositioned itself while we were watching the storm over the Sandias, which meant that whatever was happening in that lot had been building before we even registered it as something to pay attention to. We'd been watched from the moment we pulled in, maybe, and the whole thing had proceeded at a pace, a deliberate, measured pace, like someone who had done this before and knew exactly how long to let things sit before the next move. Megan left 3 days later when her belt arrived, and a shop in Bernalillo got the loaf back running. We hugged in the parking lot of an O'Reilly Auto Parts, and she said to be careful, and I said she too, and she drove her van north toward Colorado, and I drove mine nowhere in particular for about an hour. I do that when I need to think, just drive with no destination, let the highway run. I went back to Minol about a week later. Daytime, full sun, 10 in the morning. I just drove past slowly and looked. The lot was empty. The Dodge Ram was gone. Someone had left a pair of boots near the back fence. Work boots, laces still tied, sitting upright side by side in the dirt like whoever had taken them off intended to come back for them. I don't know why that hit me the way it did. Maybe because of how neat they were. How placed. I didn't stop. I drove past and kept going and told myself it meant nothing, and I almost believed it, and I haven't parked on Minol Boulevard since. There are a lot of lots in Albuquerque. There is absolutely no reason to use that one. About 3 weeks after the night on Minol, I got a message through a Vanlife forum I'd been part of for a couple years. The forum is mostly practical stuff, generator repairs, stealth parking tips, water tank problems, but there's a section for local warnings, the kind of thing where someone posts, avoid the rest stop on mile marker 214 in Arizona, sketchy activity last 2 weeks. I checked it in frequently, but someone had tagged me in a post, which pushed a notification to my email. The post was from a user called HWY60Remy, someone I didn't know, and it was short. It said they parked on Minol in Albuquerque 3 nights ago and had a strange experience and were wondering if anyone else had been through that lot recently. They described a dark truck in the back corner. They described a light in the camper shell. They described feeling watched. I sat with my laptop on my knees in the Walmart lot in Grants, New Mexico. I've been working my way west slowly, and I read the post 3 times. Then I typed a reply and deleted it. Typed another one. Deleted it too. What do you say? That it's real? That something is operating in that lot with enough consistency that 2 separate travelers, weeks apart, had the same experience in the same sequence? The forum would either believe it or it wouldn't. And either way, naming it made it more real in a way I wasn't sure I was ready for. What I ended up posting was simple. I parked there 3 weeks ago, had a similar experience, left around 2 a.m., would not go back. I posted the part about the knock on the wall because that felt like the most important detail, the thing that separated it from regular late-night paranoia. The wall, not the door. Within 6 hours, there were 4 more replies. 3 were from people saying they'd heard general warnings about that area of Minall and to be careful near vacant commercial lots anywhere on the east side. 1 was from someone with a username I didn't recognize, a long string of numbers, and it said only this: he picked spots with 1 exit. You had 2. That's why you're still here. The account had been created that day. No other posts. I reported it to the forum moderators mostly out of reflex, and when I checked back the next morning the account was gone, deleted or removed, I couldn't tell which. The reply was gone with it. I'd taken a screenshot on instinct right after I read it. I've looked at it more times than I want to admit. 1 exit. I've thought about that a lot. The lot on Minall has 2 ways out. The main entrance on the boulevard and a service break in the fence on the east side that connects to the maintenance yard access road. I noticed that access break when we pulled in, filed it as a possible secondary exit the way I always do, and forgotten about it in the business of parking and making dinner and watching a storm. But it was there. We'd had 2 ways out. I think about what that message was saying, and I think about the boots left side by side in the dirt, laces tied like a person just stepped out of them and kept going. I think about the truck that repositioned itself while we were watching lightning and thinking about nothing at all. I think about the pace of it, the patience of it, and how the most unsettling thing about the whole night wasn't the knock or the light or the figure of the wall. It was the feeling, sitting in that Flying J at 3 in the morning with Megan's hands wrapped around a paper cup, that whatever had been in that lot with us had simply decided, for its own reasons, not to finish what it started. I still live in the Winnebago, still park in lots, still find my spots the way I always have, reading the street, reading the light, reading the space between things. I'm more careful now, not paralyzed, just careful. I keep the deadbolt thrown. I keep the keys in my hand before I need them. And I always make sure I know where the second exit is before I cut the engine for the night. I haven't heard from Megan since she drove north. I hope she's somewhere bright. My name is Sylvia Okafor. I'm 47 years old, and I live in a converted school bus, a short-body International I bought at auction in Tulsa 3 years ago and spent 8 months gutting and rebuilding from the floor up. I painted it dark green, pulled out the seats, put in a wood platform bed, a composting toilet behind a curtain, and a small cast-iron wood stove I probably shouldn't have installed, but absolutely did anyway. I call it nothing. I never named it. My daughter thinks that's sad. My daughter is 23 and lives in an apartment in Austin with 2 roommates and a strong opinion about everything. So I take her assessments with some salt. I've been moving through New Mexico for about 2 weeks, coming down from Colorado along the Rio Grande, sticking mostly to the river corridor. The plan, loose as it was to end up in Truth or Consequences eventually, maybe soak in one of the hot spring bathhouses there, eat some green chili, and figure out what came next. I'm a ceramicist. I sell work online and at markets, and I carry a small portable wheel and about 40 pounds of clay wherever I go. The bus has a shelf above the wheel where finished pieces sit wrapped in moving blankets, waiting to be photographed and listed. It's a whole operation. Unglamorous, but mine. The spot I found that evening was outside of Velarde, in the Rio Grande del Norte corridor, down a 2-track dirt road that dropped off the highway and ended at a flat gravel bar above the river. I'd seen it on a BLM dispersed camping map I kept printed and folded in the sun visor. The road was rough. The bus bottomed out twice on rocks, but the payoff was real. I came around to stand at Cottonwoods, and there was the river, wide and flat and green-brown in the evening light, with the black basalt walls of the gorge rising on the far bank, and the sky going orange and pink above them. I cut the engine and just sat there for a minute with the windows down. There was one other camp at the site, a couple in a Subaru Outback with a rooftop tent, maybe late 20s, clearly on a weekend trip. They had a camp share situation going and a small fire already lit, and they waved when I pulled in, which I returned. I parked a polite distance away, far enough to not be in each other's space, close enough that we were technically sharing the same clearing. The river made its sound, that constant moving water sound that fills in all the other silence. And the cottonwoods moved in the same light downstream breeze, and I thought, yeah, okay, this one's good. The couple's names were Tad and Priya. I learned this because Tad came over about 20 minutes after I'd parked, ostensibly to ask if I needed help leveling. The gravel bar had a gentle slope, and the bus listed maybe 2 degrees to the left, but really, I think, just to be friendly in the way that young, outdoorsy couples on weekend trips are friendly, with a lot of energy and an unspoken need to tell someone about the route they drove. Tad was the talker. Priya, I'd see later, was the one who actually paid attention to things. I declined the leveling help. I had a handle, but I talked to Tad for a bit by the front wheel of the bus. He told me they'd come from Santa Fe, that this was their 3rd time at this spot, that the fishing was good in the morning if you got upstream before the light hit the water directly. He asked about the bus with the low-key awe that people who don't live in vehicles always have for people who do, and I gave him the short version, which I've gotten efficient at. He mentioned, almost as an aside, that there'd been someone else camped here earlier in the day, a man, alone, in a white pickup, who had left sometime in the afternoon. He mentioned it the way you mention a weather detail. Casually, it registered and I moved on. I made dinner as the last light left the gorge. Canned black beans warmed on the 2-burner with an egg cracked into them and some dried chili flakes and a corn tortilla I'd been carrying since Española. I ate sitting on the bus steps with my boots off and my feet in the gravel and watched the river go dark. Tad and Priya's fire flickered across the clearing. Someone, Priya, I thought, laughed at something. The river kept moving. I felt this specific tire that comes from driving dirt roads all day, the kind that sits in your lower back and behind your eyes, and I thought about the hot springs and truth or consequences and decided I'd try to get there in 2 days. I cleaned up, wedged the door, and read for a while by headlamp. Then I turned it off and lay in the dark and listened to the river and the cottonwoods and let myself go to sleep without any trouble at all. The trouble came later, around the time the moon cleared the gorge rim and put a pale stripe of light across the floor of the bus through the gap in the curtains. I woke up, not gradually, not from a noise exactly, but with the abrupt, full consciousness that sometimes happens when something is already wrong before your mind has named it. I lay still. I listened. The river, the cottonwoods, and something else underneath both of those sounds that I couldn't immediately place. I lay there for what felt like a long time trying to figure out what I was hearing. It wasn't a sound exactly, more like an absence that kept shifting. You know how sometimes you sense a pattern in ambient noise and then you can't stop noticing it? Like a rhythm in white noise that might be real or might be your brain imposing order. It was like that. The river moved, and somewhere underneath it or alongside it, there was something with a cadence that didn't belong to water. I sat up slowly. The bus was warm. The stove had been out for hours, but the thermal mass of the cast iron still held some heat, and the moonlight on the floor was bright enough that I didn't need a lamp. I moved to the window above my bed and looked out through the curtain gap. The clearing was silver and still. Tad and Priya's fire was completely out, just a dark ring of stones. Their rooftop tent was up and zipped. No movement. I moved to the front of the bus, crouched, staying below the window line out of habit more than reason, and looked out the big windshield at the gravel bar and the river beyond it. The river was pewter-colored in the moonlight, broken up by the rocks at the near edge where the water was shallow, and for a moment it was just beautiful in the way that New Mexico at night under a moon is just beautiful, and I thought maybe I'd imagine the whole thing. Then I saw him, downstream, maybe 60 yards at the edge of the cottonwood stand where the gravel bar met the tree line. A man standing in the shallows, not moving, not fishing, no rod, no equipment visible, just standing in the river in the dark with the water around his ankles and his back to me, looking downstream at the gorge. He was wearing light-colored clothing, a white or pale gray shirt, which was the only reason I could see him at all. I watched him for a full 2 minutes. He didn't move. Not even the small constant adjustments that a body makes when standing. The weight shifts the slight sway. He was as still as the basalt walls above him. The river moved around his feet, and he stood in it like something that had always been there. I'm not the type who jumps to conclusions. I've been on the road long enough to have seen all kinds of people in all kinds of contexts, and I know that the vast majority of strange things have boring explanations. A man standing in a river at night could be an insomniac, a person who likes the cold water on their feet, someone processing grief, someone having a spiritual moment, someone very drunk. All of those things. I ran them all. I kept running them while I watched him stand there and not move for another minute and a half. What I couldn't fit into any of those explanations was when he turned. Not toward the camp. Not toward me. He turned to face the far bank, still not moving his feet, just rotating at the torso, and he looked up at the gorge wall across the river. And then he went very still again in that new position, like a weather vane that had just registered a change in wind direction and then locked in place. I went back and checked the door. It was wedged. I thought about going to wake Tad and Priya and immediately felt the social awkwardness of that. What exactly would I say? There's a man standing in the river? That's not a crime. That's not even particularly strange by New Mexico standards. I decided to wait. I sat cross-legged on the bed and watched the windshield from the back of the bus, which gave me a partial sight line to the cottonwoods if I angled right. And I waited to see what he did next. He didn't do anything next. After some time, I'd stopped tracking the minutes by then. I shifted to check the downstream view, and he was simply gone. Not walking away, not wading back to shore, just no longer there. The river moved. The cottonwoods moved. The gravel bar was empty and silver, and the gorge wall across the water was dark and still. I sat with my back against the wall of the bus and my knees up and thought about that for a long time. Morning came the way it always does in canyon country. Fast and sideways, the light hitting the gorge rim first and then dropping into the clearing like something being poured. I hadn't really slept after seeing the man in the river. I drifted maybe twice, each time waking up with a jolt, and by 6 I gave up and started the propane and made coffee and sat on the bus steps with a mug and watched the river in the early light. Tad came out of the rooftop tent around 7, climbed down the Subaru's ladder in his socks, and made the small bleary walk to the river's edge that morning campers make. He stood there looking at the water the same way I had looked at it 6 hours earlier, and I almost said something. I almost said, "Hey, did you notice anyone down by the cottonwoods last night?" But I held it. I wasn't ready to make a conversation yet. Priya came out 20 minutes later. She made tea, an electric kettle off a power bank, very efficient, and she walked over and asked if she could sit, and I said sure. She was quieter than Tad, more interior, and she sat with her mug and looked at the river without filling the silence with talk, which I immediately appreciated. After a bit, she said, without particular emphasis, "Did you see the man last night?" I looked at her. She was watching the river. She said she'd woken up around 2 and had looked out the mesh window of the rooftop tent and seen someone standing downstream near the cottonwoods. She said she'd watched him for a while and then fallen back asleep, and in the morning wasn't sure if she dreamed it. I told her I'd seen him too. She turned and looked at me then, directly, carefully, and said, "He was there when we came the last time. Different man, I thought, but same spot." That landed differently than I expected. Not frightening exactly, not yet, but it reshaped what I'd been thinking, which was that I'd encountered one strange person on one strange night. If the spot had a pattern to it, that was something else. I walked down to the cottonwoods after breakfast by myself while Tad was breaking down camp. The gravel gave way to silt near the tree line, and the silt held prints well. My own immediately, crisp and clear, and before mine, overlapping and older, the prints of someone else. Bare feet, I realized, which I hadn't expected. Large, the toes spread, wide the way bare feet are when they've been bare a long time. The prints went to the water's edge and stopped. They didn't come back from the water. I stood at the edge of the river and looked at the wet gravel where the prints ended, and then at the water, and then downstream where the cottonwoods thinned and the gorge opened out. Upstream, I could hear Tad and Priya loading their car. I should have left then. I know that now. My particular failure, The thing I did that I still go back and pick apart was curiosity. I'm a maker, fundamentally. I build things and I study things and I want to understand how they work. And that instinct does not have an off switch even when it should. Instead of loading up and driving north, I decided to spend one more day. I told myself it was because the spot was beautiful and I hadn't fired up the wheel yet and I wanted to work. That was partially true. The other part was that I wanted to know what came back to that spot at night. Tad and Priya left around 9. Priya gave me her number before she got in the car and said to text if anything weird happened, with a matter-of-factness that I found both reassuring and slightly alarming. Then they drove out down the 2-track, and I was alone with the river and the basalt and the cottonwoods and about 40 pounds of clay wrapped in plastic bags under the wheel shelf. I worked all day. That part was genuinely good. I set up the wheel outside in the sun, ran it off the bus's battery bank, and threw pots for 5 hours while the river moved and the light changed on the gorge walls and a red-tailed hawk worked the thermals above the rim. I made 6 pieces I liked. I ate lunch without really tasting it because I was in that focused state where the work takes over and the body just maintains itself on autopilot. By late afternoon, I had dried clay on my arms to the elbow and I was tired in the good productive way. And for a few hours, I had genuinely not thought about the night before. Then the sun dropped behind the gorge rim, and the clearing went into shadow all at once, and the temperature dropped with it, and the river changed color from green to gray, and I started packing up the wheel and felt the first small hook of something I didn't want to name pulling in my sternum. I locked the wheel inside, wrapped the new pieces carefully, made dinner, and did everything I would normally do on a normal evening at a normal camp. I was performing normalcy for myself, which is its own kind of strange. The wood stove was going by 7. I'd found dry cottonwood branches up the bank, and the bus was warm and smelled like wood smoke and damp clay, and I sat with my second coffee and told myself I was fine. At 9:30, I checked the door, threw the wedge, and turned off the light. I didn't intend to watch for anything. I genuinely tried to sleep, but at some point close to midnight, I was at the windshield again, same position as the night before, watching the silver gravel bar in the dark cottonwoods and the river going its constant silver way. He was there earlier this time. Or not earlier. I didn't know when he'd arrived, but I'd been at the windshield for less than 2 minutes when I registered him. Same place, same pale shirt, standing in the shallows. But not facing away this time. Facing the bus. I stayed very still. The windshield was dark from the outside. No interior lights, no glow, and the bus was a dark green mass in the moonlight, and there was no reason he should have been able to identify me at the window from 60 yards. But the fact that he was facing the camp, facing the bus, made something cold and direct move through my chest. He took a step, not toward the bus, sideways, deeper into the river, until the water was at his knees. Then he stopped again. The river moved around him, and he stood in it, and I watched, and he didn't move, and I didn't move, and the cottonwoods made their dry leaf sound in a breeze I couldn't feel through the glass. Then he sat down in the river, just sat down cross-legged in the current, with the water flowing around and over him at the waist. And he stayed there. I watched him for 20 minutes. The water was cold, late spring, snowmelt cold, the kind that takes your breath, and he sat in it like it was nothing, like he was at a table. I thought about the bare footprints in the silt. I thought about the fact that Priya had seen someone here weeks ago and said she thought it was a different man, but wasn't sure. I thought about the white pickup that had been here and left before I arrived. At some point while I was watching, something shifted in my perception of the shape in the water. It was the shirt, or what I'd been reading as a shirt. In the direct moonlight, sitting in the river, the pale thing I'd been seeing wasn't fabric moving the way fabric moves in water. It was skin. He wasn't wearing a shirt. I moved back from the windshield slowly. I picked up my phone, opened it under the blanket to muffle the screen glow, and texted Priya. He's back. In the river. Sitting in it. No shirt. Sent it knowing she was probably asleep, and I'd get nothing back. Then I sat in the dark bus and thought about what I actually knew, which was a man came to this gravel bar at night and stood, and then sat in cold river water in the dark. That was what I knew. Everything else was interpretation. What I knew I had to do was leave, and what I had to do before I left was start the bus without the sound drawing his attention before I was moving. The bus is loud. There's no version of starting a diesel school bus engine quietly. I thought about the two-track road behind me. It curved through the cottonwoods before it hit the highway, maybe 200 yards of dirt. If I started the engine cold, I'd have maybe 30 seconds of confusion before anyone outside knew I was moving, and 30 seconds at low speed on a dirt road wasn't going to get me to the highway. I sat with that problem for a few minutes. Then I looked out the windshield again. The river was empty. The shallows where he'd been sitting were just water and moonlight and rocks. I stared at the cottonwood line, the gravel bar, the silt bank where I'd found the footprints that morning. Nothing. The clearing was completely still. And what rose in me then wasn't relief. It was something I can only describe as the specific dread of not knowing where a thing is anymore. Because 60 seconds ago, I knew exactly where he was, and now I didn't. And the bus was the only structure in that clearing, and I was alone in it. I started the engine. I put in gear. I drove out of there with my foot harder on the pedal than I needed, branches scraping the sides of the bus in the dark, the two-track jolting me in the seat until I hit the highway and the tires finally found asphalt, and I drove south toward Española without stopping for 45 minutes. Priya texted back at 6:50 the next morning. "Are you okay? We can come back." I was parked in the lot of a grocery store in Española by then, sun coming in the windshield, two new pieces cracked from the rough drive. I could hear one of them shifting in its wrapping when I moved, and I texted back that I was fine and thanked her and said don't come back. I meant that last part for both of us. I sat with the story for a few days before I started picking at it rationally. That's my process: feel first, analyze later. The analysis went like this. A man who comes to a specific spot on a river at night, across at least two separate visits by different travelers, who sits in cold water in the dark without apparent distress, who leaves no return tracks in the silt, who arrives and departs without being observed doing either. The no return tracks thing bothered me most. I'm a woman who makes things with her hands, and I pay close attention to physical evidence. I've spent enough time outdoors to read sight pretty well. Those bare footprints went to the water's edge and they didn't come back, which meant either he waded in and went downriver. Possible the current was manageable and the basalt gorge has ledges you can walk along in shallow flow, or I'd missed the exit tracks in the dark, or there was something wrong with my read of the site. I went with the second option because it was the most rational. But I thought about it. I got to truth or consequences 4 days later than I planned, and I soaked in a hot spring bathhouse on the main street for 2 hours and let the mineral water pull something out of my shoulders I hadn't realized was there. The woman who ran the place, 50s, dined with the particular calm of someone who has been watching people come and go for a long time. Brought me a glass of water and asked where I'd come from, and I told her, and she asked which route, and I said the river road through Velarde, and she made a small sound that wasn't quite a word and changed the subject. I thought about asking her what the sound meant and decided not to. Some knowledge doesn't improve anything. I looked up the Rio Grande del Norte area when I had good signal again. There's a lot of history along that river corridor. Indigenous sites, old Spanish land grants, stretches of the gorge that are still used for ceremonial purposes, places where the land has a significance that doesn't make it onto the BLM dispersed camping map. Velarde has been inhabited continuously for a very long time. The river there has been a boundary and a resource and a spiritual site for longer than the United States has been a concept. I'm not from there. I was a visitor with a portable wheel and 40 pounds of clay parked on a gravel bar that someone had been using in ways I had no context for reasons I had no access to. I don't know what the man in the river was doing. I made peace with that mostly. What stays with me isn't the image of him sitting in the current, though that image is extremely clear in my memory, silver water and pale skin and the absolute stillness of him. It's the footprints, the way they went to the water and ended, the way the river just kept moving past the place where they stopped, indifferent and constant, carrying whatever it carried. My daughter called me the week after one of our regular Sunday calls. She asked how New Mexico was, and I said, beautiful and strange, and she laughed and said, when wasn't it? I didn't tell her about the river. She worries about me in the bus, and I don't always give her new material. But I've thought about telling her. I've thought about what I would actually say, how I would explain the feeling of watching someone sit in cold, dark water and feel, with complete certainty, that they weren't lost or drunk or grieving. that they were exactly where they meant to be, doing exactly what they came to do, and that you, with your bus and your wheel and your wrapped clay and your lock on the door, were the thing that didn't belong there. I still have the 2 pieces that cracked on the drive out of Velarde. I kept them on the shelf, broken the way they are. I'm not sure why. Something about the specific shapes of the brakes. Maybe the way a thing can fracture and still hold together. Or maybe I just haven't decided yet whether to throw them out. My name is Cutter Briggs. I'm 52 years old, and I live out of a 1998 Chevrolet Express cargo van that I converted myself over the course of a winter in my sister's driveway in Amarillo. I insulated it with rigid foam, built a platform bed that lifts for storage underneath, put in a 12-volt fridge the size of carry-on bag, and mounted a solar panel on the roof that does about 80% of what I need it to do. The other 20% I figure out as I go. I've been on the road for 14 months. Before that, I was a finishing carpenter for 22 years, which means I can fix almost anything, and I notice when things aren't level. Both of those traits have served me well out here. I was heading west on I-10, coming off 3 days in Las Cruces where I'd picked up a short cash job helping a guy reframe a bathroom. Word gets around in Vanlife circles that I'm useful with tools, and sometimes that translates into work. The job paid enough to top off my propane and my checking account both, and I was feeling the specific looseness that comes with a few $100s and no particular deadline. The plan was to cross into Arizona, eventually, maybe work my way up to Tucson. The plan was also entirely negotiable. 9 miles west of Lordsburg, the van started pulling hard to the right. Not a blowout. I know that feeling, the sudden lurch, and the wheel going live in your hands. This was something slower. A leak, I figured. I got off an unmarked exit that turned out to be a Tulane County road going north into the Pyramid Mountains, pulled to the shoulder, and confirmed it. The front passenger tire was 30 pounds low and dropping. I had a spare, but the shoulder on that county road was barely wide enough to work safely. So I drove on the soft tire for another quarter mile until I found a wider spot, an unpaved pull-off where the road met a cattle fence, big enough for 3 vehicles, with a dry wash running along the far edge and the mountains sitting dark and close to the north. It was 5:30 in the afternoon. The light was doing what desert light does at that hour, going golden and horizontal, throwing long shadows off every rock and fence post, making everything look like a film still. I got out, assessed the tire, and started working. I've changed enough tires that it's fully automatic, jack placement, lug order, the whole sequence. I had the spare on in under 20 minutes. What I noticed while I was down on the ground was that the pull-off had been used recently. There were tire tracks in the dust, multiple sets, and the remnants of a fire ring off to one side. Not a campfire setup, no rock circle, just a blackened patch on the ground with some ash and a melted piece of plastic partially buried in it. Recent enough that the ash hadn't blown flat. I didn't think much of it. Desert pull-offs collect all kinds of traffic, ranchers, hunters, people doing exactly what I was doing and stopping because they needed to. I filed the fire ring away as a data point and moved on, except I didn't actually move on because by the time I'd changed a tire, it was pushing 6:15 and the light was fading, and I had a long stretch of nothing between me and the Arizona border, and I'd been driving since 9 that morning. So I made the practical decision, which was to camp right there. I had dinner, rice and black beans from the Instant Pot. I ran off the inverter with some hot sauce from a bottle I'd been nursing since Albuquerque, and I ate in the van with the side door open, watching the last light leave the Pyramid Mountains. They're not famous mountains. They don't show up on postcards, but they have a specific quality in the evening, very dark, very sudden, like they were placed there without apology, and I appreciated that. I have a soft spot for landscape that doesn't perform for you. A truck passed on the county road around 7. Slowing as it went by the pull-off. Ranch truck, older, domestic. It slowed but didn't stop, and I caught a glimpse of the driver. Male hat, the standard silhouette, before it continued north. I noted the slowdown. In a pull-off on a county road 9 miles from the interstate, a van with solar panels on the roof is an unusual sight, and people look. I ate my rice and didn't worry about it. By 8, I cleaned up and was sitting on a platform bed with a road atlas, paper, the big Rand McNally kind, which I keep because it doesn't need a signal, looking at the Arizona route options. The dry wash outside made a sound when the wind came through it, a dry, papery rattle from the desert plants along its bank. The mountains were invisible now against the dark sky. A half moon was up. Normal night sounds, normal desert quiet. I turned the atlas page, found Tucson, started thinking about timing. That was when I heard the second vehicle come off the county road and pull into the pull-off behind me. I didn't look up immediately. Vehicles pulled into pull-offs. That was the entire point of pull-offs. I closed the atlas, sat on the bed beside me, and listened. The engine ran for a moment after pulling in, then cut off. No door opened, no voices, just the tick of a cooling engine and then the desert quiet settling back and around it. I moved to the front of the van and looked through the gap in the curtain I'd hung behind the front seats. Another van, older than mine, a full-size Dodge with white paint gone gray from sun and dust, parked about 30 feet back. No interior light, no movement. The half moon gave enough light to see the outline clearly. It sat low and flat, no roof rack, no modifications visible from this angle. One of those vans that could be a contractor's vehicle, or it could be someone's home, or it could be a dozen other things. I watched it for a few minutes. Nothing happened. I told myself I was fine. I pulled into plenty of spots and sat for a while before getting out and making camp. People did that. You arrive somewhere, you take a minute to check the place out from inside before committing. Completely normal. I went back to the atlas, read for another half hour, and when I checked again, the Dodge was still sitting dark and still with no sign of occupancy. What happened next is something I've tried to narrate clearly to myself, and it keeps coming out wrong because the sequence matters and I can't always put it in the right order. At some point, maybe 9:30, maybe 10, I became aware that the van was no longer alone back there. I hadn't heard a door, but there was a shape in my side mirror, just at the edge of what the moonlight reached, standing at the rear corner of the Dodge. Just standing, not doing anything. I watched the mirror for a while. The shape didn't move. I'm a carpenter. I have a spatial brain. I've done enough rough framing in bad light that I can estimate distances and proportions reasonably well from limited information. The shape was a person standing at the corner of the van, roughly average height, hands at the sides, not moving. Now, if you pulled into a rest area and stood still at the corner of your van for 5 straight minutes in the dark, somebody would probably ask if you were okay. It's not what people do. People get out of their vehicle and stretch or walk around or get something out of the back. They move with purpose. Standing still next to a vehicle in a desert pull-off at 10 at night, adjacent to a stranger's camp, is its own kind of communication even if no word is spoken. I registered it as such. I moved to the back of my van, away from the mirror toward the rear doors, and looked through the small rear window. Better angle. The shape was there, still at the corner of the Dodge. And now I could see there was a second shape, lower, near the ground on the driver's side of the Dodge. Crouching or sitting. I hadn't seen that one before. I stood at my rear window and tried to work out when the second person had appeared and couldn't. That was the thing that changed the texture of the night for me. Not one person doing something strange. 2 people arranged in a way that suggested an awareness of my van sight lines. One visible in the mirror I was most likely to check, one low and out of that sight line, near the ground. I've done enough renovation work in occupied houses to know when someone has thought about a space. And someone had thought about the geometry of this pull-off. I went to the driver's seat. Quietly, no light. I put the key in the ignition and held it there without turning it. I ran through the practical math. County road going north toward the mountains, south toward the interstate. The Dodge was parked directly behind me with about 30 feet of clearance. If I needed to go, I'd have to pull forward into the desert scrub to get around them, or I'd have to reverse toward them to get enough angle to pull out past them. Neither of those was clean. The standing figure moved. Not toward my van, sideways, following the far edge of the pull-off toward the dry wash. It moved slowly, without apparent hurry, and then stopped at the edge of the wash and stood there looking down into it, as if it had found something interesting down there in the dark, as if the wash had been the destination all along and the standing near the van had been incidental. I didn't believe the incidental part. I turned the key and started the engine. No preamble, no more deliberating. I'd done the deliberating and I was done with it. The van started on the first crank, which I was grateful for, and I immediately pulled forward into the scrub to get angle on the road. The creosote bushes scraped the undercarriage, and I went over a rock that jolted the whole frame, but I got the nose pointed toward the county road, and I pushed it. In the sweep of the headlights as I turned, I caught the pull-off for just a second. The Dodge was there. The standing figure had turned from the wash and was facing me now, or facing the headlights. I couldn't see a face. The low shape near the driver's side of the Dodge was gone. I didn't see where it had gone. I was already moving. I got onto the county road heading south and pushed the van up to 60, which was faster than that road wanted to go. The washboard surface rattled everything in the van. I heard something fall off the shelf above the bed, heard the Instant Pot shift in its bungee, and I held the speed anyway until I hit the I-10 on-ramp and the pavement smoothed out and I could breathe again. I drove east, back toward Lordsburg, which felt wrong directionally but right in terms of lights and people and a reason to stop. There's a truck stop just off exit 22 in Lordsburg. Small, not a chain, just a gas station with a diner attached and a gravel lot where truckers park overnight. I pulled in and sat under the lot lights for a while with the engine running. A trucker was doing a walk-around inspection on his rig 2 spots over, flashlight going along the trailer sides in that methodical way, and the normalcy of it did what normalcy does in those moments, which is to make the thing you just left feel slightly less real. I turned the engine off. I sat. I'm not a person who panics. 22 years of construction work will calibrate you. You deal with what's actually in front of you, and you don't burn energy on what might be. What had been in front of me was 2 people behaving in a way that strongly suggested coordination around my specific location. That was enough. I didn't need to build a narrative on top of it. I made the right call getting out, and that was the whole of it. What I couldn't let go of was the tire. I've been running fine all day, no pull, no vibration, nothing that suggested pressure loss. A slow leak from a nail or a valve stem can come on gradually, but I checked the tires in Las Cruces before I left, habit, and they'd been solid. The leak that had put me on that county road in the first place had come on fast enough to pull the van off a straight line in under 20 miles. I sat in the truck stop lot and thought about that. You can let the air out of a tire valve in under 30 seconds. You can do it while a van is parked at, say, a grocery store or a job site, or a place where a person might leave their vehicle for a few hours. I parked outside the bathroom supply shop in Las Cruces for about 40 minutes while I returned to rental on a tile saw. The van had been unattended, visible from the road, in a strip mall lot. I had no reason to think anyone had touched it there. I had no reason not to think it, either now. The diner attached to the truck stop was still serving. I went in and ordered coffee and eggs and sat at the counter and let the place do its work on me. The smell of the griddle, the low country music from a radio behind the counter, a waitress who called me hon without effect and refilled without asking. I ate slowly and tried to think about Tucson and not about the geometry of a pull-off 9 miles west of where I was sitting. By the time I paid and went back to the van, it was close to midnight, and the lot had filled up with a few more truckers and one other camper van, a newer Sprinter with out-of-state plates. I parked next to the Sprinter for the company of proximity and sat on my bed and checked the van's interior out of habit. Everything where it should be. The thing that had fallen off the shelf was a paperback, spine cracked, lying on the floor. I picked it up, sat on the bed, lay down. I slept, eventually. Not well, but I slept. In the morning, I checked the tire I'd replaced and the 3 remaining originals. The front driver's side, the one directly opposite the one that had gone soft, had a valve cap that was cross-threaded. Not over-tightened, cross-threaded, the way it goes when someone has put it back in a hurry in the dark. I sat on the ground next to the front driver tire for a long time, turning that valve cap on my fingers. A cross-threaded cap doesn't mean someone tampered with the valve. It means someone touched the cap, or it means it's been cross-threaded for months and I never noticed, which was possible but unlikely because I'm the kind of person who notices cross-threaded fasteners. It's a professional hazard. What I did was methodical. I checked all 3 remaining tires, pressures, valve stems, caps. The front driver was down 4 pounds, which could be a slow natural leak or could be a valve that had been partially opened and recapped in a hurry. The other 2 were fine. I wrote down the pressures in the small notebook I keep in the console and decided to check again in an hour to see if the front driver was still losing air. While I waited, I went back into the diner for more coffee and thought through the previous 24 hours as plainly as I could. The tire issue in Las Cruces could be coincidence. The pull-off could be two people who happened to stop there and happened to behave strangely. The low figure near the Dodge that I couldn't account for could have been there the whole time and I'd missed it in the initial observation. All of those could be true. The tire cap could have been cross-threaded by me on the last rotation without noticing. But I'm a finisher. I close things out. I seal the gaps. And the gap in the sequence that I couldn't seal was the specific nature of that pull-off, the way one figure had positioned itself in my most likely sight line while the other stayed low and out of it. That's not random. That's spatial thinking. And spatial thinking applied to someone else's vehicle and someone else's position in a dark lot only goes one direction. I went back to the van after an hour. The front driver was down another 2 pounds. Slow leak, probably the valve stem. I put a proper seal on it with a replacement cap from my spares kit. Monitored it for 30 minutes, it held. Probably just the valve. I kept telling myself that. I called my sister in Amarillo. Not because I was scared, I want to be clear about that, but because she's the person I talk things through with and I needed to talk something through. Her name is Ren, and she is 55 and relentlessly practical, and she has been telling me for 14 months that the Vanlife thing is going to get me killed, so I have to calibrate how much I tell her. I told her about the pull-off in a version that emphasized the strangeness of the behavior and left out the tire detail, and she listened without interrupting, which meant she was actually listening. When I finished, she said, "Did you get out?" I said yes. She said, "Then you did the right thing." And I could tell from her voice she wanted to say more and was choosing not to. I pushed west after that, made it across the state line by noon, and stopped in Lordsburg only long enough to grab water and fuel. The Pyramid Mountains were already behind me, already just a dark shape in the rear view, shrinking. New Mexico was doing what New Mexico does, which is fill the mirror with that high flat light and those wide, empty distances that make everything look simultaneously close and impossibly far. I picked up a few days of work in Tucson the following week, a kitchen remodel, tile and trim. And I slept fine in a strip mall lot near the job site and told myself the whole Lordsburg thing was reseeding. And it was mostly, except for one thing that I kept coming back to and couldn't drop. Before I'd left the pull-off, in those seconds when the headlights swept across as I turned, the figure that had been standing at the wash had turned to face me. No face visible, just a shape in the light, arms at the sides. But the positioning of it, it hadn't moved toward me, hadn't moved away, just turned and stood there in the headlight wash like it was waiting to be looked at. Like it wanted me to see it there in that spot before I left. I've thought about what that might mean. I haven't landed on anything satisfying. What I keep coming back to is the low figure, the one crouching by the driver's side of the Dodge that disappeared between one look and the next. I'd assumed it had gone back inside the van. But if the standing figure was providing a distraction, positioning itself to hold attention on the wash side, then the low figure could have gone anywhere. Around the Dodge, into the scrub, to the rear of my van. I checked my van's exterior carefully in Lordsburg in the morning light and found nothing. No marks, no damage, nothing placed on or near it. So either my theory was wrong, or whoever had been crouching in the dark was better at this than I wanted to think about. I'm in Tucson now, 3 weeks out from Lordsburg. The kitchen job wrapped up, and I've got another lined up starting Monday. Bathroom demo on the east side, older house, the kind of job where you don't know what's behind the walls until you open them up. I like that kind of work. The uncertainty is part of it. I posted about the Lordsburg pull-off on a Vanlife safety forum I joined after a bad experience at a rest stop in Oklahoma 8 months ago. Kept it factual, location, timing, the behavior I observed, the tire. No theories, no conclusions. Just what I saw. Within a day, I had 11 replies. Most were the usual. People sharing their own unnerving experiences, some helpful, some just venting. But 2 of them were specific to that stretch of I-10 west of Lordsburg. One person said they'd had a tire go soft at nearly the same mileage, different month, also pulled off on the same county road. They'd noticed a vehicle already in the pull-off and had decided not to stop, driven on the soft tire another 2 miles to a lit rest area. They thought nothing of it at the time. Connecting it to my post, they said, was a strange feeling. The second reply was from someone who drove long haul and knew that stretch well. They said the county road north of that exit was a dead end, terminated at a private ranch gate about 4 miles in, no outlet, no through traffic, which meant anyone who pulled off onto it wasn't passing through. They were going to pull off, specifically, or they were turning around. The ranch gate itself was padlocked and had been for years, according to this person, since the property changed hands. A dead-end road, a pull-off at the bottom of it with a blackened patch of ground and melted plastic in the ash. Tire tracks from multiple vehicles. I thought about all of that. I thought about the fact that a dead-end road at night, off an interstate, with a pull-off big enough for several vehicles, is either nothing or it's a place where things happen that require certain geography. No through traffic. One entrance. If you're in it, you're in it. Unless you're paying attention before the moment comes when paying attention is no longer enough. I tightened up some things after Lordsburg. I rechecked all 4 tires every morning, not just occasionally. I started parking differently, angle first, so I always had a clear pull-forward exit. I got a small motion sensor for the exterior, battery-powered, that chirps inside the van if something comes within a certain range. Basic stuff. The kind of modifications that would have looked paranoid to me 14 months ago and look like common sense now. My sister asked on our next call if I was thinking about coming back to Amarillo. I said no. She said the offer was open, and I said I knew. She said the driveway was still there, and I said I knew that too. It's a conversation we've been having in some form since I left, and I think we'll keep having it, and I think the answer will stay the same for a while yet. What I know about that pull-off 9 miles past Lordsburg is this. I don't know what was planned for that night, and I probably never will. I know I left before whatever it was could develop into something nameable. I know the tire got me there, and I've spent real time thinking about whether that was bad luck, or whether bad luck is sometimes a word we use for things that were set in motion before we noticed them. There are a lot of pull-offs between here and anywhere. I still use them. You have to. That's the nature of the life. But I pull in slow now, before I cut the engine, and I sit in the driver's seat, and I read the space the way I read a job site before I pick up a tool. Where are the exits? What's already there? What doesn't fit? What's been used recently that shouldn't have been? It's not a perfect system. Nothing is. But I haven't had another Lordsburg, and I've put about 9,000 miles on since then, and most nights I sleep fine. Most nights. My name is Renata Voss. I'm 41 years old, and I live in a 2009 Ford E350 extended cargo van that I've been converting slowly for the past 4 years. Emphasis on slowly, because I am not handy and I refuse to pretend otherwise. The bed frame is solid. The insulation is solid. Everything else is sort of provisional, held together by a combination of YouTube tutorials and stubbornness and the occasional intervention of strangers who actually know what they're doing. I grew up in Portland, Oregon, spent 12 years there working in hospital administration, and then one spring I did the math on what my life was costing versus what it was giving me, and I quit, sold my furniture, and drove south. That was 4 years ago. I don't miss the furniture. I travel with a dog named Soot, a 7-year-old black lab mix I got from a rescue in Medford, Oregon, who has the energy of a much younger dog and the emotional intelligence of a therapist. He sleeps at the foot of the bed and has strong opinions about rest stops and will absolutely tell me, through a specific sequence of sighs, when he thinks I've been driving too long. He was the one who got me to stop that Tuesday evening outside of T. Harris. I've been pushing east on I-40, coming off a 3-day stay in Albuquerque where I'd visited a friend from my hospital days who'd relocated there, and I was tired and Soot was restless, and the light was going, and I took the T. Harris exit without a particular plan. T. Harris is one of those places that exists in the gap between things, between Albuquerque and the East Mountains, between the city and the high desert, sitting in a canyon where the Sandia and Manzano Mountains meet. The town itself is small, mostly residential, quiet in a way that feels earned rather than empty. I'd driven through it before without stopping. That evening, I took a county road south off the main street. following it until it went from paved to graded gravel to something that was technically 2 tire tracks with ambitions, and came out on a flat bench above a dry arroyo with a view west back toward the city. Albuquerque from that distance, at dusk, looks like someone scattered copper coins across a dark tray. The city lights were just starting to come up as I parked, and the Sandia Mountains above and behind me were doing the thing they do at that hour, going from pink to purple to a deep red so saturated it looks painted. The Sandias are named for watermelon, supposedly because of that color. I'd read that somewhere. I thought about it while Soot investigated the scrub around the van, nose working, tail moving steadily. I made a simple dinner, pasta with olive oil and Jared pesto. The kind of meal that requires almost no attention and tastes better outside than it has any right to, and ate it on the van step with Soot beside me waiting with profound patience for anything that might fall. Nothing fell. He was dignified about it. We sat until the city lights below were fully up and the sky above was doing its full dark thing, the Milky Way beginning to suggest itself in the south, and I thought about how this particular kind of evening is the whole argument for this particular kind of life. And I was right, and then I went inside and went to sleep. Soot woke me at 2:12 in the morning, not barking. He's not a barker, but standing on the bed with all 4 feet, which is his version of urgent, a posture he reserves for genuine concern and the occasional very compelling smell. I put my hand on him automatically and felt the low vibration in his chest, a held-back sound. And I came awake fully and quickly the way you do when the animal who shares your space has decided something is worth waking you for. I lay still for a moment. I listened. The arroyo below the bench made a dry sound in the wind. The mountains were up there in the dark, and somewhere outside, close, within the distance that makes the hair on your arms move, there was a light. Not a flashlight beam, not a phone, a light that was low and diffuse and orange, the color of a flame that isn't quite a fire. It moved in a way that wasn't wind, not the random flutter of something burning in a breeze, but a steady lateral drift left to right about 20 yards out from the van. So its chest was still vibrating under my hand. I kept my palm on him and watched the light through the gap in the curtains and tried to place it in a category of things that made sense. Candle lantern, maybe carried by someone walking. That was the most rational option. A hiker coming back late, or someone camped nearby who'd gotten up in the night. The light moved steadily for a few seconds, then stopped, then moved again in a slightly different direction, not continuing a straight path, but shifting, reorienting like something searching. I watched it stop and start 3 more times before I sat up fully. Soot moved with me, tracking the light through the curtains now, his nose at the gap in the fabric. His tail was not moving. Soot's tail is a reliable instrument. When it's still, I pay attention. I dress quickly, boots, jacket, the sequence I gotten efficient at, and I reached under the driver's seat for the thing I keep there, which is a flashlight the size of small bat that throws about 800 lumens when I need to make a point. I'm a solo female traveler in a van. I don't carry a weapon, but I carry that flashlight, and I've made peace with the implication. I didn't go outside. I want to be clear about that. I'm not the person who opens the door to investigate the strange light in the dark. I went to the front of the van and looked through the windshield and got a wider angle on the terrain. The light was maybe 50 feet out now, or had been and was now moving. It was hard to track without a fixed reference point. The bench I was parked on was flat and open, creosote and bunch grass and scattered rock. No structures, no other vehicles when I pulled in. I couldn't see anyone carrying the light. Just the light itself, moving through the scrub. Then it went out. Not gradually, not the way a candle gets shielded or dies. Off like a switch. The landscape outside went back to moonlight and the distant copper glow of Albuquerque in the west. And I sat in the dark driver's seat with my hand on Soot's back and waited. He settled after a few minutes. Not relaxed. He stayed upright, alert, ears working, but the vibration in his chest stopped and his tail did one slow sweep and then went still again. I've learned to use him as a gauge. When Soot decides the immediate situation is over, I believe him. When he stays locked in, I stay locked in with him. He was somewhere in between. I didn't sleep after that. I sat in the driver's seat with the keys in my hand and watched the bench until the sky started going gray in the east, which happens fast in the high desert, the dark just peeling back at the edges. At full light, I got out with Soot on his leash. He never pulls, he's good like that. And I walked the area where I thought the light had been. The scrub was undisturbed in the way that desert scrub is undisturbed. Everything dry, everything low, no obvious trail through it. But in one spot, maybe 40 feet from the van, I found something that stopped me. A small arrangement on the ground. 4 rocks set in a rough square, maybe 8 inches on a side, with a piece of burned wood in the center. Not a campfire remnant. The rocks were placed deliberately with a flatness and evenness that doesn't happen by accident or weather. The burned wood was a single stick about the length of my forearm, charred at one end, the unburned portion pale and smooth and recently cut. The cut end was fresh. The wood hadn't dried to gray yet. I stood over it and looked at it for a while. Soot sniffed the perimeter of the rocks once, and then sat beside me and looked at it too. In that way dogs have of matching your attention to something even when they've already processed it with their nose and moved on. I took a photo. Then I looked around the bench, the whole sweep of it, at the arroyo below and the mountains above and the road I'd come in on. Nothing. No one. Just the early light on the high desert and the city already starting to haze in the distance. I drove out without eating breakfast. Some mornings are like that. I told myself the rock arrangement was something innocuous, a trail marker, a land art project, something kids had made. People made things in the desert. It was a thing people did. I told myself this with reasonable conviction for about 40 minutes while I drove east on I-40, and then I pulled off at a rest area near Edgewood and sat with my coffee and my phone and looked at the photo I'd taken. It looked more deliberate in the photo than it had in person. The 4 rocks were not random. They were similar in size, similar in flatness, placed at what looked like measured intervals. The burned stick in the center was precisely centered, and something I hadn't fully registered while standing over it. The rocks were wet on their upper surfaces, not damp from dew. Wet like they'd been placed recently, within the last few hours after the night temperatures had dropped below the dew point, meaning they'd been placed while I was parked on that bench, while I was asleep before the light woke me. Or while I was watching the light and not watching the area around the van. That last possibility arranged itself unpleasantly in my thinking. The light moving in one direction while something else was set up in another. I sat with that and drank my coffee and looked at Soot in the rear view, who was doing his long-legged stretch across the back platform and looking at me with the patient expression of a dog waiting for the human to figure something out. I posted the photo to a small private group I'm part of, Women Solo Travelers in Vans, about 60 members, a mix of full-timers and weekend people. Good group, no drama, good information, people who've been doing this long enough to know the difference between a story worth telling and a story worth being careful about. I described the night simply and posted the photo and asked if anyone had seen anything similar. By the time I'd driven another hour east toward the Estancia Valley, I had 9 responses. Most were variations of, "That's strange, be careful." 2 people mentioned that the area around Tijeras had some documented history as a site for various ceremonial uses going back a long time, and that occasional markers of different kinds showed up in the backcountry and were generally best left alone. One woman said she'd camped on a bench south of Tijeras 2 years ago and had experienced what she called light anomalies at night and hadn't gone back. I read that response twice. Light anomalies. What none of this answered was the practical question of whether someone had been moving around my van in the dark while I was distracted by whatever the light was. I thought about the arrangement's position. 40 feet from the van, slightly behind and to the left on the side away from the benches drop toward the arroyo. Accessible from the arroyo side, in other words, someone coming up from below, in the dark, placing something, leaving, while the light moved on the other side. I'm not a person who believes in supernatural explanations before I've run out of human ones. I have not run out of human ones. What I believe is this. Someone knew that bench, knew it well enough to move across it in the dark without a light of their own, knew where the approach from the arroyo was, and knew what a moving light at 2 in the morning would do to a person in a parked van, which is pull their attention forward and to the right and keep it there. Whether the thing placed 40 feet from the van was meaningful in itself or was simply evidence of access, Evidence that someone had been that close, that quietly, that deliberately, I couldn't say. But one of those options was frightening for mystical reasons, and the other was frightening for very concrete ones. And I found myself equally unwilling to dismiss either. I called my friend in Albuquerque, Diane, who I'd just spent 3 days with, who had left hospital administration 2 years after me to become a social worker and had therefore upgraded her exposure to the full range of human behavior. I described the night. She listened without the kind of noises people make when they're waiting to tell you you're being irrational. When I finished, she said, "The light and the placement were coordinated." Not a question. I said that was what I was thinking. She said, "Then there was more than one person." I said yes. She said to come back to Albuquerque if I wanted, and I said I'd think about it. And she knew me well enough to know that meant probably not. I spent the next 2 days moving through the Estancia Valley, which is flat and brown and enormous, and sits at 6,000 feet and makes you feel, in a specific productive way, like the world has more square footage than you remembered. I parked in different spots each night. One night at the edge of a dry lake bed outside Willard. One night in a gravel lot behind a feed store in Moriarty, whose owner had a handwritten sign saying overnight parking okay. I slept with the motion sensor I'd bought at a hardware store in Edgewood propped against the rear door, set to vibrate on my wrist through a cheap watch I'd paired it with. Janky system. It worked. Nothing happened those 2 nights. That was its own kind of information. Either I'd left the relevant geography behind, or I was simply in lower traffic spots, and the pattern had been specific to that bench above T. Harris. I leaned toward the latter. The bench was accessible from the Arroyo, close to a main highway, with a wide view toward the city that made it attractive to anyone looking for a scenic overnight pull-off. If someone was operating in that area, that bench was an obvious place to watch. I went back to T. Harris on the 3rd day. I know how that sounds, but I'm the kind of person who has to close the loop, and the loop on this one had a specific open end that I needed to look at in daylight with a clear head. I drove the county road back up to the bench mid-morning, parked in the same spot, got out with soot, and walked the area systematically. The rock arrangement was gone. Not scattered, not kicked apart. Gone, rocks and burned stick both, as if it had been removed. The ground where it had been was undisturbed. I stood over the empty patch of dirt and felt the absence of it like a specific statement. Someone had come back and cleaned it up. I walked the Arroyo approach that I'd theorized about, down the south edge of the bench to where the Arroyo's bank flattened out, and came up from below in a natural ramp. It was an easy approach. Hard-packed dirt, stable footing, almost no loose rock. Quiet underfoot. I stood at the top of the ramp, where someone coming up from the Arroyo would first have a clear line to the bench, and look back at where the van had been parked. Clear sight line, easy distance, and from the van's position, the Arroyo side was the blind side. You'd have to be specifically watching that approach to catch anyone using it. So it had his nose going the whole time. At the top of the Arroyo ramp, he sat down and looked at me in the way he does when he's found something and is waiting for me to acknowledge it. I looked at the ground where he was sitting. The dirt there was softer than the bench, retained moisture longer, being lower and sheltered. There were shoe prints, several, overlapping, at least 2 different tread patterns. One set went up the ramp and onto the bench. One set went back down. I took photos and I left. I didn't feel the need to stay longer. The loop was closed, or closed enough. Not answered, but closed. Someone had used that Arroyo approach while I was parked on the bench. Someone had come back in daylight and removed the marker. Whether the goal had been to frighten, to surveil, to do something I'd interrupted by leaving early, or something else entirely, I didn't know and accepted that I wasn't going to know. Some things don't resolve into meaning. They just happened, and you carry them. What I did on the way back down the county road was stop at the one house I passed. A small adobe setback from the road, older, with a garden that was doing well in the dry air and a truck in the driveway. I knocked on the door. A man in his 60s answered, weathered, calm, the particular unhurried energy of someone who's lived in the same place for a long time. I told him I'd camped on the bench the previous week and had some unusual experiences and asked if he knew anything about activity in that area at night. I kept it vague on purpose. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "There's been people using that bench for a few years. Not hikers." He didn't elaborate on what he meant by that. I asked if he'd reported it to anyone, and he said to who exactly, with a tone that was not unfriendly, but made the answer clear. He said the county road didn't really belong to anybody that did anything about things like this. He looked at Soot. He said the dog was probably the best thing I had going for me up there, and I said I knew, and he nodded and went back inside. I've been thinking about what "not hikers" means ever since. It's a phrase with a lot of room in it. I've filled that room with various things at various hours, some more alarming than others, and I've tried to land on an interpretation that accounts for all the specific details without collapsing into either the rational or the irrational. I haven't fully gotten there. What I know concretely, a bench above T. Harris Canyon had been used at night repeatedly by people who knew its approach routes, who worked in coordination, and who cleaned up after themselves. The light that woke me was almost certainly a deliberate distraction. The placement near the van was done quietly from the blind side while I watched the light. The marker was removed before I came back, which means they knew I'd come back, or assumed it was likely, or simply cleaned up as a matter of habit. None of that requires a supernatural explanation. All of it requires people who were comfortable in that specific landscape at night and had a reason to be on that bench that they didn't want examined. The burned stick and the rocks could be ritual, or they could be a mark, a signal to others, a record of presence, something that meant something in a language I didn't have. The removal of it afterwards suggested it had completed its purpose, whatever that was. I shared the full account with the women's travel group, including the shoe prints and the man's comment about not hikers. The responses were more careful this time. 3 women said they'd heard vague warnings about the T. Harris area specifically, always secondhand, never with enough detail to act on. 1 woman, who'd been full-timing for 8 years and whose judgment I'd come to trust from her posts, said simply, "Some spots get claimed. Not legally, just claimed. You can't always know what for." I read that and sat with it and decided it was the most useful framing I'd found. Diane called from Albuquerque on a Sunday, and we talked for an hour. The easy rambling kind of call where you cover a lot of ground without a particular destination. Toward the end, she asked if I was okay. I said I was. She said the T. Harris thing had been bothering her, and I said me too, honestly, but less than it had. She asked what had changed, and I thought about it and said I'd gone back and looked at it in daylight, and it had stayed strange but stopped feeling personal. She said that was a healthy distinction, and I said, yeah, I thought so too. So it's been fine. That's the thing I keep coming back to. He was alert that night. He ran the arroyo with me. He found his shoe prints, but he was never the specific kind of alarm that means immediate danger. Dogs read threat in a way that bypasses all the narrative your brain wants to build around it. And his read on the whole situation, both nights, was, something is here. Something has been here. It is not nothing, but you're not in immediate danger right now. I trust that. I've trusted it before, and it's been right. I'm in the Sacramento Mountains now, east of Alamogordo, parked in a pine forest at about 8,000 feet where the air smells like something cleaned. It's cold at night, and the van holds heat well, and soot takes up more than a share of the bed in a way I've never corrected. I have work lined up, a few remote data projects for a healthcare nonprofit that I do periodically, nothing that requires me to be anywhere specific. The mountains here are quiet in the way that different from the desert's quiet, fuller, somehow, with bird sound and wind in the trees and the occasional crack of a branch in the night that is absolutely just a branch. I still look at the arroyo approaches. I do it automatically now. The way Cutter Briggs probably checks tire pressure and the way Derek Folsom checks for secondary exits. The small practiced attentions that this life teaches you if you're paying any attention at all. You learn the landscape before you settle into it. You learn what belongs and what doesn't. You keep the dog close. You note what the light does. And if something moves out there in the dark that doesn't have a clean explanation, you watch it and you think and you make your decision before the window closes. That's the whole of it, really. That's the skill. My name is Obadiah, Obi Thurston. I'm 59 years old, and I live in a 2001 Coachman Leprechaun, a classy motorhome, 26 feet, on a Ford E450 chassis that has given me exactly one major problem in 3 years, which was a blown water pump outside of Flagstaff that cost me 4 days and $800. I was a high school history teacher for 31 years in Boise, Idaho. I retired 14 months ago, sold the house I'd owned for 20 years to a young couple who seemed genuinely excited about the wallpaper I'd always hated, and drove south. I have a pension that covers my basics, a bad knee that I manage with ibuprofen and stubbornness, and a strong preference for places that don't ask too much of me socially. The motorhome suits all three. I was working my way through the boot heel of New Mexico, that squared off southern corner that most people skip over on their way between Tucson and El Paso, specifically because most people skip it. I'd been through the area once before, 20 years ago on a school trip to the Gila Cliff dwellings, and what I remembered was space and silence and the specific quality of light that comes with high desert and minimal human infrastructure. It had held up. The Gila country is still the emptiest inhabited place I've been in the continental United States, and I mean that as high praise. I pulled off New Mexico Highway 9 that Wednesday evening outside of Columbus, a small border town that most Americans couldn't place on a map, but that has a specific, vivid history involving Pancho Villa and a 1916 raid that I taught in my world history unit for 2 decades. The town sits right at the Mexican border, flat and sun-scoured, with the Palomas crossing a few hundred yards from the main street and the Tres Hermanas Mountains sitting dark to the north. I'd always wanted to see it in person. I'd spent an entire class period every year on that raid, the last armed foreign incursion on U.S. soil, technically, which students consistently found more interesting than I expected. The spot I found was east of town, down a dirt track that ran between 2 old agricultural operations. One clearly still active, with irrigation equipment and a water tank visible from the road, one long abandoned. The abandoned one had a low concrete building at its center, roofless, the walls standing about chest height, with rusted equipment around it and a gravel lot beside it where something industrial had once been processed. The gravel lot was flat and clear and large enough for the coachman with room to spare. An information post near the road edge said the land was BLM administered and dispersed camping was permitted. I made the methodical checks I always make: level, tires, propane, nothing impeding the slide out. And then I stood outside in the early evening and looked at the abandoned building for a while. Concrete walls, no roof, rusted rebar sticking up at intervals, a square opening on the south face that had once been a door. The plaster that had covered the exterior was mostly gone, revealing the concrete blocks underneath. The building had probably been a processing facility for agricultural product. There were remnants of metal ductwork along the top of one wall, and it had been abandoned long enough that the ground inside the roofless shell was indistinguishable from the ground outside it. Weeds and compacted caliche and old glass. My neighbor for the night, as it turned out, was a man named Fitzgerald Ames. Fitz, he said, immediately, the way people who've had formal names their whole lives learn to preempt them. He was 44, a wildlife biologist doing survey work for a university out of Las Cruces, driving a government-issued Dodge Ram with equipment cases bolted to a rack in the bed. He'd been parked at the far end of the gravel lot when I pulled in, and he came over with the friendly but professionally calibrated manner of someone who spent a lot of time in the field and had learned to read whether another person wanted company or solitude. I apparently read as company. We talked for an hour in the cooling evening, sitting in camp chairs outside respective vehicles, the Tres Hermanas going dark to the north, and the border fence visible as a thin line to the south. Fitz was surveying aplomado falcons, a species that had been reintroduced to the boot heel after a long absence. And he talked about them with the focused enthusiasm of someone whose work had never stopped being interesting to them. I liked him immediately. He had the particular quality of people who spent a lot of time alone in the field, comfortable and quiet, precise with words, genuinely curious about other people's experience without being intrusive about it. He mentioned the abandoned building before I brought it up. He'd camped at this spot twice before for his survey work, he said, and both times he'd noticed something about the building that he didn't have an explanation for. I asked what he meant. He said that on his first visit he'd found ash in the interior, fresh ash, in a pile in the center of the floor, with no other evidence of occupancy. On his second visit, 6 weeks later, the ash was gone. The floor was clean. He'd assumed someone had cleaned it up or it had blown off in the wind, but there was no wind disturbance to the surrounding dirt. He'd filed it away as one of those things. I looked at the building from where we were sitting. The square doorway opening faced south, toward the border, dark and still in the last of the evening light. I said that was interesting. He said yeah, he thought so too. We talked about other things after that, but I kept looking at that opening. Fitz turned in around 9:30, early start for the Falcon survey. He said he needed to be at his first transect point before first light. We shook hands, and he went to his truck, and I went to the coachman and locked up and made a cup of tea and sat at the small dinette with a book I'd been reading slowly for 2 weeks, a history of the Apache Wars in this specific region. Fitting, given where I was. The Boot Heel was Apache country, contested ground for a long time, and the land had that quality that contested ground sometimes keeps. By 10:30, I was in bed. The motorhome was quiet, the border country was quiet, and I was tired from a long drive down from Silver City, and I fell asleep without trouble. What woke me, and I want to describe this carefully because it wasn't dramatic, it was very small, was a smell. Wood smoke, faint, the specific char smell of something that had recently burned. Not a wildfire smell, not a campfire smell. Something smaller and more contained. I lay still in the dark and breathed it in and placed it, coming from the front of the motorhome, through the small vent I'd left cracked above the cab. I checked the clock, 1:47 a.m. I sat up and reached for the window above my bed and opened it a half inch and listened. The border country at night has almost no ambient sound. No traffic, no town noise, just the occasional coyote impossibly far off and the settling sound a structure makes when the temperature drops. I heard nothing beyond those, but the smell was there, faint and definite. I pulled on clothes and went to the front of the motorhome and sat in the driver's seat in the dark. Through the windshield, the gravel lot was visible in the moonlight. Fitz's truck, dark and still, and beyond it the abandoned building with its chest-high walls and the square of the south doorway. The doorway was dark. The lot was still. Nothing moved. And then, from inside the walls of the building, from behind the chest-high concrete where I couldn't see the floor, a light came up. Orange low, pulsing slowly. A fire small, newly started. Someone was inside the roofless building at 2 in the morning, lighting a fire on the floor. I sat in the driver's seat and watched the glow behind the walls. It rose and fell slightly, the way a controlled small fire does, never getting bright enough to throw light above the wall tops. Whoever was in there was keeping it contained, keeping it low. I thought about what Fitz had said, ash in the center of the floor, twice, cleaned up. Someone who came to this specific building, lit a specific kind of fire, and cleaned up afterward. Someone who knew the spot and used it on a schedule that didn't advertise itself. I thought about Fitz in his truck. Asleep, windows up, early start tomorrow. The truck was between me and the building. I thought about going to wake him and immediately ran through the practical reality of that. 2 men, one of them 59 with a bad knee, knocking on the wall of a concrete building at 2 in the morning to ask someone what they were doing. That wasn't a plan. That was an incident. I did something instead that I'm still not entirely sure was smart. I got out my phone and took a video through the windshield. 12 seconds. The glowing walls, the dark lot, the truck, the border country behind it all. The video is dark and not particularly illuminating in the visual sense, but you can see the glow and you can see it's not a fixed light source. It moves the way fire moves. I sent it to my own email, so it was backed up somewhere, then sat back and watched. The fire stayed low for about 20 minutes. I timed it. Then it went out, not slowly, not burning down to coals, but extinguished deliberately. All at once, the glow simply ceasing behind the walls. The building went dark. The lot went back to moonlight. I sat watching the south doorway for movement and saw none. Nobody came out of that doorway while I was watching it, which meant either they'd left through a gap in the wall I couldn't see from my angle, or they were still in there in the dark. Both of those options had their own distinct quality of unpleasantness. I sat in the driver's seat until 3:15, watching the building produce nothing, and then I made myself go back to bed because I needed to function in the morning, and sitting in the dark watching a wall was not accomplishing anything. I left the cab vent closed this time. I told Fitz at first light. He was breaking down his survey kit by the truck. When I came out, moving with the efficient, unhurried speed of someone who's set up and broken down camp so many times the sequence is fully automatic. I walked over and described what I'd seen, the time, the glow, the duration, the extinguishing. He stopped what he was doing and listened, and then he looked at the building for a moment and said, "Same as before then. Low fire, deliberate, cleaned up." He pulled out his phone and looked at something, a calendar, I thought, and said that his 2 previous visits with the ash had been about 6 weeks apart. The current visit was 6 weeks after the second one. Neither of us said the obvious thing out loud for a moment. Then Fitz said he'd like a look at the building before he left, and I said I'd come with him. We walked across the gravel lot in the early light, the tracer mantis throwing long shadows east, the border fence glinting in the distance. The south doorway was a clean rectangle of shadow. We went in. The floor was caliche and packed dirt, flat, with the weeds I'd seen from a distance. In the center of the floor, there was a circle of ash, roughly 18 inches across, with no surrounding burn marks. The fire had been contained to that circle, which suggested something underneath it, a pan or stone surface that had held the ash and prevented spread. The ash was fresh, still faintly warm when Fitz crouched and held his palm above it without touching. Around the ash circle, arranged with a spacing I recognized as deliberate, were 7 small objects. I counted them twice. Bones. Not full bones, fragments, small, the size of a finger joint. Burned at the ends, but intact in the middle portions. Fitz looked at the arrangement without touching it. He's a biologist. He knows bone. He looked for a while and then stood up and said quietly that he thought they were animal bones, small mammal, but that he wasn't certain. He said the arrangement and the ash were consistent with practices he'd seen documented in the Chihuahuan borderlands, both on the Mexican and American sides, that had various sources and various purposes, and that he was not qualified to interpret. He said that last part carefully, like a man who'd learned to be careful about it. I photographed everything. The ash circle, the bone fragments, the spacing, the relationship to the walls, and the doorway. I did it methodically, the way I used to document primary sources for lesson plans. Whole image, detail, context, sequence. Old habit. Then we walked out and stood in the lot, and Fitz said he was going to note the location in his survey records, and that he'd mentioned the ash to his department contact at the university on a previous visit, and the contact had suggested leaving it alone and not publicizing the location. He said that with a specific emphasis that I understood. Fitz left at 6:15. We exchanged numbers, and he said to reach out if I came through Las Cruces, and I said I would. I watched his truck go down the dirt track to the highway, and then I was alone in the lot with the coachman and the building and the bones still arranged on the floor in there, and the border fence a thin line to the south. I should have left. I've had this conversation with myself many times since. I was a history teacher for 31 years, and I know better than most people that there are places and practices that have been continuous for longer than the frameworks most Americans use to understand the world, and that the appropriate response to encountering those practices is not to plant yourself in the middle of them. I know that. I stayed anyway, not out of disrespect. I want to be clear about that, but because I've been teaching about this region for 2 decades from a remove, and I was suddenly, physically, in it, and something in me was not ready to drive away. I sat in the motorhome all day. I read. I made meals. I walked the perimeter of the lot twice, not going back inside the building. The day was hot and still, and the trace of mantis sat against the sky, and the border fence did its thing in the distance, and trucks passed occasionally on Highway 9, a half-mile south. Normal day. The building sat with its walls and its contents and did nothing. At 4 in the afternoon, a vehicle came down the dirt track from the highway. Not a government truck, not a camper, an older sedan, dark green, dusty local plates. It slowed when it reached the lot, and I was outside by the motorhome, and I watched it slow. It stopped at the edge of the gravel, engine running. I could see the driver, a woman, middle-aged or older. I couldn't be precise at that distance. She looked at the motorhome for a long moment. Then she looked at the building. Then she looked at me. Then she drove away back toward the highway without pulling in. I stood in the lot after her dust settled and felt something I can only describe as having been assessed. Not threatened, There was nothing overtly threatening about a woman in a sedan stopping to look. But she had come to this specific location and looked at the specific combination of elements, motorhome, building, me, and made a decision and left. That sequence had a logic to it I couldn't read from the outside. I made dinner that evening with less appetite than usual. Canned soup, crackers, the kind of meal that's more about the act of eating than the eating itself. I sat at the dinette and looked out the side window at the building and thought about what Fitz's university contact had said. Leave it alone. Don't publicize the location. That was a specific kind of advice, given by someone who knew what they were talking about. And I had been given a version of it by implication and had elected to stay for a day anyway. And now I was sitting in the middle of it at 7 in the evening watching the light change on the walls. I decided to leave in the morning. That sounds like a small decision, but it cost something. There's a particular pride that comes with 31 years of standing in front of teenagers and being the person who explains things. And that pride does not age out of you gracefully. What I was sitting with was the recognition that there were things happening in this place that I was not equipped to explain, and that the right response to that was not to stay until I could explain them. It was to leave. At 10 o'clock, I went to bed with that decision made, and I felt better for having made it. I slept for 2 hours. What woke me was not a smell this time. It was a sound. Voices. Low, not carrying words, just the cadence of speech in a language I couldn't identify from inside the motorhome. Coming from the building, I lay still and listened. Multiple voices, 3, maybe 4, speaking in a rhythm that was not conversational. Even steady low, no fire visible through the window. I could see the top of the east wall from my bed, and it was dark above the wall line. Whatever was happening there was happening without visible fire this time, or with a fire smaller than the night before. I did not get up. I want to be precise about this. I made a deliberate decision to stay in the bed in the dark and not go to the window and not go to the driver's seat and not do anything except lie still and listen to the voices continue their low, even cadence until they stopped. It took a long time. 40 minutes, I think, though I wasn't tracking it carefully. The voices simply ceased at some point, the way the fire had ceased the night before. Not fading, not finishing, just no longer there. Silence, and then the border country's own thin night noise. In the morning, I walked to the building one last time before I left. The ash circle was still there from the night before, but the bone fragments had been rearranged. The 7 pieces were now in a single line, pointing south, toward the border, toward Mexico, toward the Palomas crossing a mile down the road. Precise, deliberate, the direction unmistakable. I stood over them and looked at the south doorway and the thin line of the border fence beyond it and thought about the history of this specific ground. The raid, the centuries before the raid, the boundary that cuts across what was once a single continuous geography. The bones pointed south like a compass. I left them exactly as they were. I walked back to the coachman, started the engine, pulled out of the gravel lot, and got back on Highway 9 heading east. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. That's not a dramatic gesture. I just had nothing left to process from that direction, and I was ready to be somewhere else. I've been in Silver City for 2 weeks now, which is a longer stop than I usually make, but Silver City will do that to you. It's a small town that punches considerably above its weight in terms of food and art and general quality of life, and it sits at 6,000 feet in the Pinos Altos Mountains where the evenings are cool even in summer. I found a monthly RV lot on the edge of town run by a retired couple who give me space and leave me alone, which is the ideal arrangement. I've thought about Columbus and the Cannery Building every day since I left. Not with dread, exactly. It's more specific than that. What I keep coming back to is the woman in the green sedan. The way she looked at the motorhome and then the building and then me in that sequence and then driven away. She hadn't been alarmed. She hadn't been aggressive. She had looked at the situation and made an assessment and acted on it, quickly and cleanly. Whatever she'd come to do, or come to check on, she decided not to do it with me there. That means she'd had the option to come back later. After I left, presumably if I was the variable that needed a change. Whatever had happened on those 2 nights, the fire, the voices, the rearranged bones pointing south, had happened regardless of my presence because I'd been right there in the lot and it had proceeded. But something about the daytime visit had been conditional on my absence. I filed a note with the BLM field office in Las Cruces. Not a complaint. I want to be clear about that, because what I observed was not anything I could characterize as dangerous or illegal with any confidence. I described the location, the dates, the ash circle, the bone fragments. I mentioned Fitz by name and noted that he'd observed similar evidence on previous visits and had reported it to his university department. I framed it as an observation report, the kind a former teacher writes when he wants something documented without advocating for a particular response. The field office sent back a form acknowledgement. I don't know if anything came of it. I called my daughter in Boise on a Sunday. She's 28, teaches elementary school, has her mother's patience and my stubbornness in a combination that seems to be working well for her. I told her about Columbus without the bone detail, which I left out because it would worry her more than the situation warranted. I told her about the history, the Villa raid, the border fence, the Tres Hermanas. She asked if I'd gone into Mexico, and I said no, just looked at it from a distance. She said that sounded like me. She wasn't wrong. What I've decided, and this is the version of the Columbus story I tell myself, the interpretation I've landed on after 2 weeks of turning it over, is that I parked on a Monday and was still there on a Tuesday, and that specific timing put me inside a rhythm I couldn't see from the outside. The 6-week interval Fitz had identified. The woman coming to check the location on the second day. The shift from fire alone to fire and voices. These weren't random events accumulating. They were steps in something that had its own schedule and its own logic, and I had parked my retired teacher motorhome in the middle of it because the BLM sign said dispersed camping permitted and the gravel was level. There's a thing I used to tell students about primary sources, that the most important question to ask about any document is not what it says, but what it was made for, and who it was made for, and whether you are the intended audience. I stood in that building and looked at bones arranged in a line pointing south, and I was very clearly not the intended audience. I was a 59-year-old man from Boise with a bad knee and a pension and no framework for what I was looking at. The building wasn't for me. The fire wasn't for me. The voices in the dark weren't for me. And the bones pointed not at me, but past me, south, toward whatever they were pointing toward across the border. I think about those bones sometimes, still in their line on the caliche floor, pointing south in the empty building with the border fence in the distance, and no one watching. Doing what they were arranged to do regardless of whether anyone was there to see it. That's the part that stays with me. The completeness of something that didn't need my presence or my understanding to be fully itself. I find that thought more settling than unsettling, honestly. Some things in this world are intact without you. That's not a threat. That's just the world being larger than you are. I still have 14 months on this road, minimum. Probably more. There are a lot of places left. My name is Dara Kinsley. I'm 38 years old, and I live in a 1996 Dodge Ram conversion van that I bought from a church in Gallup for $2,200 cash. The church had used it for a shuttle, airport runs, hospital visits, that kind of thing, and it still had the bench seats bolted to the floor when I got it, which I ripped out myself with a borrowed impact driver and a level of determination that surprised even me. I put in a platform bed, a foam mattress, a cooler I run passively with ice every few days, and a canvas curtain between the cab and the living area that I sewed myself on a machine I borrowed from my aunt in Farmington. It's not fancy. It works. I've been living in it for 11 months, since the end of a relationship and the lease that went with it. And in those 11 months, I've put more miles on it than I did in the previous 5 years of driving conventional vehicles. I do freelance environmental consulting, water quality assessments, mostly small municipalities and agricultural operations that can't afford the big firms. I work remotely for the most part, submit reports digitally, have conference calls from parking lots with good signal, and occasionally drive to a site in person when boots on the ground are required. It's flexible work, which is the point. It pays modestly, which is also the point, because modestly is enough when you don't have rent. I grew up in Farmington, went to New Mexico State for environmental science, spent 5 years at a firm in Albuquerque, and then the lease ended and I ended and here I am. I've been hired to do a preliminary water quality assessment near Elephant Butte Reservoir, the big one, the largest lake in New Mexico, sitting in the Rio Grande Valley north of truth or consequences. The client was a small irrigation district concerned about runoff from a livestock operation on the south arm of the reservoir. And the work was 2 days of sampling and documentation, followed by a week of analysis back in the van. I've been there before on personal trips. The reservoir has campgrounds, a state park, boating, the whole recreational package. But this was the first time I'd been there for work, which changes how you look at a place. I got there on a Thursday afternoon and set up at a campsite in the state park's main area, which was moderately populated with the usual spring mix, retirees in large RVs, a few families with boats on trailers, some weekend campers and tents. The reservoir was very low. Years of drought had pulled it down dramatically, exposing pale caliche shoreline where water had been, and the exposed lakebed had that particular bleach quality that always reads to me, professionally and personally, as a body showing its ribs. I stood at the water's edge that evening after setting up camp and looked at the exposed shore and thought about water tables and evaporation rates and the specific grief of a reservoir in decline. And then I made dinner and tried to turn off the work brain for the night. My site neighbors were a couple named One and Doug Reardon, both 53, from Truth or Consequences itself, down for a long weekend with a 20-foot aluminum fishing boat on a trailer. They've been coming to Elephant Butte for 30 years, when told me, and every year the launch was a different ramp because the water kept pulling back. Doug was a dry, quiet man who expressed opinions sparingly and accurately. When talked enough for both of them in the pleasant way of someone who genuinely likes people and doesn't require them to match her energy. I liked them both. We shared a campfire that first evening, and I answered questions about the consulting work, and they told me about the fishing, which had gotten strange when said. Strange how? I asked. She said the catches were off. Wrong species, wrong sizes, fish that shouldn't be in the south arm showing up in the north. Doug said the low water did things to the fish, changed the thermal layers, mixed populations. He said it matter-of-factly, the way fishermen talk about water, they've known long enough to track its changes. It was a good evening. The sky over the Caballo Mountains went through its full sequence, and the campfire did what campfires do, and I felt for the first time in a few weeks like the road had given me something rather than just moved me between things. I turned in around 10, slept hard, and was up at 5:30 for my first sampling run on the South Arm Access Road. The work was good, clean data, clear protocol, the specific satisfaction of knowing exactly what you're doing and doing it correctly. I logged my samples, drove back to camp, ate lunch, and spent the afternoon writing up field notes. The second day was when things started to go sideways. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way that the reservoir itself had changed, slowly, incrementally, exposing something that had been underwater long enough that nobody remembered it was there. The second sampling site was on the South Arm's far end, past the main recreation area, down a dirt access road that the irrigation district had flagged for me on a hand-drawn map. It was a longer drive than the first site, about 40 minutes on dirt from the state park, and the landscape out there was different from the main reservoir area. Quieter, emptier, the kind of space where the wind sounds louder because there's nothing to break it. The reservoir's south arm out there was very low, the exposed shoreline wide and pale and flat, with the remains of what had clearly been a boat dock visible. Just the posts, rotted to stubs, standing in the exposed mud at measured intervals. I parked, got out my equipment, and started the sampling protocol. It was methodical work, water temperature at depth, turbidity, basic chemistry, GPS coordinates for each point. I was focused and moved through it efficiently. What broke my concentration about 90 minutes in was a structure I hadn't noticed when I arrived because I'd been looking at the water. About 200 yards back from my current position, on a low rise above the exposed shoreline, there was a building. Not ruins exactly. It was standing for walls and a partial roof built from the local caliche block that blends into the landscape if you're not looking for it. I could see a window opening, no glass, and a door opening on the near side. The building was weathered to the color of the surrounding terrain, which was why I'd missed it. It sat on the rise with the Caballo Mountains behind it and the pale, exposed lakebed in front of it, and it looked like something that had always been there, waiting for the water to recede far enough that it was visible again. I'm an environmental scientist. My reflex when I see an unexpected structure in a field site is to note it, photograph it, and if time permits, examine it. I had time. I walked up to it after finishing my sample point. It was small, maybe 20 by 20 feet, single room. The roof partially collapsed on the back half. Old, I thought. Pre-reservoir. The Elephant Butte Reservoir had flooded a significant amount of land when it was completed in 1916, including several small communities and structures that had simply been inundated and forgotten under the water for decades. I knew this from general background reading, but I hadn't expected to find a standing structure this intact. Inside was mostly what you'd expect. Debris, old glass. The structural remains of what had once been a wood floor now rotted to almost nothing. But on the north wall, which was the most intact because the partial roof still covered it, there were marks. Not graffiti, older than that, cut into the caliche block rather than painted on. Geometric, repeating, the kind of marking that could be territorial or calendrical or religious, depending on the context and the tradition, and I didn't have the context or the tradition to read it. I photographed it carefully, same as I'd photograph anything in a field site. Documentation first, interpretation later. What I also found and photographed was recent evidence of occupation. Not a fire this time, nothing so obvious. But the floor debris had been disturbed in one area, moved to the sides, clearing a rough rectangle of earth in the center of the room. The clearing was recent. The debris at its edges hadn't settled or been blown back. And in the cleared area, the earth itself had been worked, smoothed, and then marked with something that had pressed lines and shapes into the damp soil. The marks were shallow and would weather out in a day or two of wind. They were fresh enough to still be crisp. I stood over them and felt the professional part of my brain doing its systematic thing. Geometry, scale, relationship to the room, relationship to the wall markings. And then the non-professional part of my brain said quietly that I was standing alone in a remote structure on the far end of a reservoir that most people didn't bother to visit, and that someone had been here recently enough that the marks in the soil were still crisp, and that I had no idea how recently meant. I walked back to the van at a pace that I told myself was purposeful rather than quick. I packed my equipment, logged the site location, photographed the building from the exterior, and added a note to my field documentation. Anomalous structure on South Arm Rise, pre-reservoir, evidence of recent occupation. Flagging for follow-up. Professional. Contained. Then I drove back to the main campground and sat in the van for 10 minutes, doing nothing in particular before I started making dinner. I didn't tell One and Doug about the building that evening. They were packing up, their long weekend was over, they were heading back to T or C in the morning, and I didn't want to insert something strange into a pleasant leaving. We had a last campfire, shorter than the first, and Doug said the fishing had been decent, and when said to come through T or C and eat at a specific restaurant she named twice, so I'd remember it. And then they went to bed, and I sat by the cooling fire alone and looked at the water. The reservoir at night is a specific thing. The low water had exposed so much shoreline that the lake's edge was far back from where it should have been, and the pale, exposed caliche caught the moonlight and threw it back in a way that made the whole lake bed glow faintly. It looked, I thought, like the negative of a lake, the shape of water's absence. I'm a water person professionally, and there's something about a diminished water body that affects me in a way I don't fully intellectualize. Like watching a patient who's lost a lot of weight. I slept lightly. I planned a third site visit the next morning, North Arm this time, easier access. What I didn't plan was waking up at 2 in the morning to the sound of a boat motor. Not close, it was out on the water, distant, moving from south to north by the sound of it. A small motor, the kind you put on a fishing boat, running slow and steady. I lay in the van and listened to it come and go over about 10 minutes. It traveled up the arm, and then the sound faded, and then, after a while, came back going the other way. I checked the time, 2:17, then 2:31 when it faded again. 14 minutes of transit, roughly. I told myself it was a fisherman. Night fishing is legal on Elephant Butte, and people do it, particularly in spring when the crappie are moving. I had no reason to connect the boat to the building I'd found, except that the building was on the south arm, and the motor had started from the south and the transit direction was south to north. The logical part of me listed those as separate data points with no proven relationship. In the morning, I drove back to the South Arm access road. Not for sampling, I had everything I needed from the previous day. I went back to look at the building in daylight with fresh eyes and the specific determination that comes from a bad night's sleep and an unresolved question. I parked at the same spot and walked up the rise. The marks in the soil inside the cleared rectangle were gone, not weathered. It had been a still night, no significant wind. Smoothed over. The same hand that had made them, I thought, had smoothed them out. The clearing itself was still there, but the earth had been worked flat, erasing whatever had been pressed into it. I crouched over it and looked at the surface and found, at the edge of the smoothed area, a partial boot print. Fresh. The tread was deep and clear in the damp soil. A work boot, heavy, size 10 or 11, pointing toward the door. I stood up and looked at the door opening and the window opening and the exposed lake bed beyond. Below the rise, where the exposed shore was flattest, I could see a line in the pale caliche that I hadn't registered before, a faint parallel track, like something had been dragged or wheeled across the dry lake bed from the waterline to the base of the rise. Narrow, consistent, maybe 40 feet of visible track before it disappeared at the edge of harder ground. The kind of track a small boat makes when you pull it out of the water. Someone had come to this building by boat last night, erased what they'd made the day before, and left before dawn. I called the state park office when I got back to the main campground, not the ranger line, the main office during business hours, asking if anyone else had access to the South Arm area beyond a main recreation zone. The woman I spoke to was helpful and said the South Arm access road was technically closed to the public past a certain gate, but that the gate was old and the chain was often loose and people got through. She said she'd pass along a note to the ranger. I thanked her. I didn't mention the building because I didn't know yet who the building belonged to or whether my being in it had itself been a trespass. I called the irrigation district client and asked if they knew anything about structures on the South Arm rise. There was a pause, and then the district manager, a man named Gerald who was efficient and spare with words, said that there were a few old pre-reservoir structures that the water table had exposed in the last several years as the reservoir declined. He said most of them were on record with the State Historic Preservation Office. He said the one on the South Arm rise had been on SHBO's list for 2 years and that there had been some discussion about access and documentation. He said it with a careful neutrality that told me there was more to that discussion than he was summarizing. I asked if anyone had been formally accessing it. He said not through the district. I thanked him and hung up and sat with that for a while. Not through the district, which left open who else might be accessing it and through what arrangement, official or otherwise. What I was building toward, and I want to be straight about this, was not a theory about something dark or criminal. What I was building toward was the recognition that this structure, exposed by declining water after possibly a century of submersion, meant something to someone in a way that was specific and non-negotiable. The marks on the wall, the worked soil, the erasing and returning, the boat crossing at 2 in the morning. These were not random or recreational. Someone was engaged with this place in a sustained way, and they were doing it quietly at night from the water, which was the approach that required the least interaction with the public-facing parts of the park. That evening, my last at the campground, I sat at the water's edge with a notebook and wrote out everything I'd observed in sequence. Field note style, precise and plain. I do this when I need to think, write it down like a report for someone else, which forces clarity. When I finished, I read it back, and the sequence was this: structure exposed by reseeding water, showing marks consistent with long use. Evidence of recent occupation, soil markings made and erased within a 24-hour window. Boat access from the water at night. Boot print indicating physical presence after the erasure. No interaction with me directly. No indication of awareness of my presence or indication of awareness and a decision not to engage. That last point was the one I kept returning to. The building was visible from my sample site. My van had been parked at the bottom of the rise. If someone had come to the building at night and left before dawn, they'd have passed within clear sight line of where I was parked. Either they hadn't noticed or they had and hadn't considered me relevant. Both possibilities said something about the nature of what they were doing there, something that existed on a track so separate from mine that I was simply not part of the calculation. I thought about what Obi might have called it. I'd heard his story through the forum, in the anonymous way these things circulate, the boot heel posting, and I thought about his framing. Not the intended audience. I had camped beside a place that was not for me, and had looked at things that were not made for my eyes, and had photographed them because my professional training said to document everything. And I wonder now whether the documentation was appropriate or whether it was its own kind of trespass. I didn't delete the photos, but I haven't included them in the client report either, and I'm still deciding whether I will. The water quality report went to the irrigation district 10 days after I left Elephant Butte. The findings were consistent with what I'd expected: elevated phosphorus and nitrogen on the south arm consistent with livestock runoff. Nothing at acute concern levels, but a trend worth monitoring. Gerald sent back a brief acknowledgement and a purchase order for the next phase of monitoring. Straightforward, professional, the kind of work that has clean edges. The building doesn't have clean edges. I've been thinking about it in the 3 weeks since, not obsessively, but in the persistent background way that unresolved things occupy space. I went back to the SHPO database that Gerald had mentioned and found the record for the structure. It was listed as a vernacular agricultural outbuilding, pre-1916, associated with one of the communities inundated when the reservoir filled. The community had been a small agricultural settlement, mostly Hispanic families who had farmed the Rio Grande floodplain for generations. When the reservoir was authorized, the residents had been displaced, some compensated inadequately, some not at all. The historical record, the usual mix of bureaucratic indifference and individual loss. The building had been their land. The reservoir had covered it for over a century. The declining water was returning it, piece by piece, the way water gives back what it takes when it finally recedes. Changed waterlog, marked by its time under, but returned. I thought about the marks on the wall that predated the reservoir. I thought about someone coming by boat at night to a building that had belonged to their people before the water took it, doing something in the cleared rectangle of floor, erasing it before daylight. Not hiding from the state park or from me. Just doing what they were there to do in the way it was meant to be done, which did not include an audience. I've thought about calling the SHPO office and reporting the evidence of occupation. I've drafted a call in my head several times. And every time I get to the part where I describe the soil markings in the boat and the erased evidence, I hear Gerald's careful neutrality and the state park woman's note passing, and I think about what follow-up would actually look like, and I decide not to call. The building is on the record. The people using it know where it is. Whatever is happening there has been happening, in some form, with some continuity, longer than the reservoir that covered it, and longer than any agency that might receive my call. What I did instead was go to the restaurant when had named twice, so I'd remember it, in truth or consequences, 2 weeks after leaving the reservoir. It was a small place on the main street, green chili cheeseburgers and decent coffee, and I sat at the counter and thought about the hot springs in the same town that Sylvia had written about on the forum, the mineral water and the woman with the particular calm, and I felt the strange, small world quality of this road, how it routes different people through the same places at different times and leaves different residue in each of them. One, and Doug came in while I was finishing my coffee. One had apparently mentioned to Doug that I'd said I might come through, and Doug had apparently remembered, which surprised me in a way that quietly observant people sometimes do. We sat for another hour and they told me the fishing on the last morning had been the best of the trip, and I told them the water quality results. The general findings, not the specific numbers, and Doug nodded with the expression of someone who'd suspected what he was hearing. When asked if I was coming back to Elephant Butte, and I said probably for follow-up sampling, and she said good, the lake needed people paying attention to it. She meant that practically about the water quality work. But I've thought about it in the other sense too, the building on the rise, the erased marks, the boat at 2 in the morning. The lake receding slowly and returning things. Things that were there before the water and are still there after it, intact in the specific way of things that were never really gone, just covered. Waiting, maybe, or just continuing without waiting, because the water schedule was never their schedule and the reservoir's decline was never their problem to solve. I'm still doing the monitoring work. I go back every 6 weeks. I do my sampling on the north arm, and the main body, and I submit my data, and Gerald sends his purchase orders. I don't go back to the South Arm Rise. I have everything I need from there professionally, and whatever else is there is not mine to document. The building is still standing. The water keeps receding. And somewhere on that pale, exposed lake bed, if you knew where to look, the drag marks from a small boat run from the waterline to the base of the rise and back again, fading a little more with each dry week, patient as the landscape they cross.